Okay, my name is Asim Ijaz-Khwaja. I am the faculty director for the Center for International Development at Harvard. My only claim to fame is that Danny hired me. And so I'm sort of thrilled about that. I'm still basking in the glow. I was going to make fun of Gordon to say, Gordon used to be at UC San Diego. It's a decent place, but it's not us. I almost got hired by them, and I was going to make fun of Gordon to say, well, you didn't hire me. Turns out Gordon joined UC San Diego the same year I had an offer from them, and so I can't blame Gordon anymore for that. I just wanted to welcome you all. This is super fun for us. We're kicking off what is going to be an exciting 2 days of lots of programming, lots of events. This is also the launch of the global sort of program for reimagining the economy. So I think it's a very special day for us. Let me just situate ourselves. I think we're in, to me, what is the most momentous moment since the last 80 years. I think the last time we really had a chance to rethink development was post-Bretton Woods. Fatma and I went to Bretton Woods, and I saw that table where I had my little fanboy moment where I saw the table where Keynes and Galbraith sat. And for me, John Maynard Keynes and John Kenneth Galbraith, these are literally giants. I mean, they were actually pretty tall as well. So they were literally intellectual giants for us. I think that's the moment, post that moment, for the last 80 years, we've done tremendous work. But I don't think we've actually seriously had a rethink in the way that moment had us do. I also think this is the right time to do it. We're confronting a world where there's a gazillion things going right and wrong. Just one example is what the new tech world will do. I'm simultaneously completely thrilled by this whole agentic AI world. Danny and I were just at a talk where we were told how research will completely, Scott Cunningham was giving a talk. If you haven't listened to him, just Google him. It's just fascinating how this world is changing. I'm also simultaneously extremely terrified. I've never felt those two emotions simultaneously for the same thing. Actually, I have once, but I won't tell you what it was. It's too close to home. But I did want to say this is a real moment, and I'm thrilled that you guys are part of this moment. I think there are two things which need to happen in this moment, and RT exemplifies that. The first is this focus on local, the power of local. Globalization did its bit, and we're very grateful for what it did, but I don't think it's quite doing the same thing as it used to. This idea that knowledge and expertise lies in the North and resources lie in the North, and this grand global spillover will happen. I think the work that Gordon and Danny are leading and Rohan is sort of executing extremely well is this idea of the power of local. What does that mean? And when you start thinking like that, I think there are two other things which go along with it, which is to truly be respectful in this conversation. You need a true collaboration. And there's a true collaboration between local and global researchers. And there are many in the room who are from those groups, but also between researchers and practitioners. And there are many of us here in that group as well. And when I talk about the second group in particular, often it feels like, well, the academics are going to bring the intellectual expertise and the practitioners are going to bring the practical experience and the execution power. I think that's wrong. I think all of us, practitioners, academics, bring in intellectual knowledge. We bring in deep intellectual domains, and I think it's a bit sort of much needed for a place like Harvard to recognize that. And I think we are recognizing that when you come to the table, each one of you has a powerful idea to contribute to us. I know Danny and Gordon personally. I know they welcome exactly that kind of exchange. I'm just thrilled to see how this day will shape up. So again, welcome. I'm grateful for you giving time to us today. I hope this will be the first of many conversations we keep having. And by the way, I love local foods. So if you want to invite me to wherever places you're from and take me on a local, I don't like the fancy restaurants, I like the local snack joints. I'm fully game for all versions of local snacks. I give it to Gordon and Danny to take it over.
Thank you, Asim. So we're here to talk about new work that we're going to be doing on thinking about the directions of global transformation. And as Asim said, it's the right moment in which to be doing that. It's a moment in which we have to be doing it. We're going to tell you just very briefly the story about how we got there. About 5 years ago, Dan and I started working together, each of us coming from different intellectual vantage points Danny, of course, has spent a magnificent career understanding the role of economic policy, often in ways that challenge the mainstream of economics, and thinking about what industrial policy actually does, rather than how we often simplistically talk about it in standard economic theoretical frameworks. And I had spent much of my career understanding the labor market consequences of globalization and the distress that came out of that. So we launched something called the Reimagining the Economy Project, which was to look at what are we actually doing to help regions in distress, and how does what we might think of as place-based policy connect with industrial policy. That was a moment as we didn't really realize how much experimentation was about to be launched. The Biden administration comes into power, you get the Inflation Reduction Act, you get the Chips and Science Act, and then you get Donald Trump, both before and after Biden, having his own version of industrial policy in terms of tariffs. But what we found as we dove in is the real action was not happening at the federal or national level. The real action was happening at the local level. The money, to be sure, a lot of that did come from the national and federal level, but the innovations, the policy action, the experimentation was being guided locally. And that was as true for in workforce development on the part of community colleges, figuring out new ways to train workers for good jobs in specific sectors that went way beyond kind of the traditional manufacturing focus. It had to do with local economies that had suffered substantial job loss, thinking about how do they transition to something new, and convening and orchestrating folks from the private sector, folks from the public sector, folks from the nonprofit sector to reimagine what they do next. And in all of that, you had the role of civil society creating non-governmental organizations that did things that, as we kept looking at it, looked a lot like development economics, except in this context, they weren't calling it development economics. They were calling it local economic development. So we've had this convergence in policy practice and policy experimentation, and in the practitioners who are undertaking policy in the developing world, where this has been going on for decades, and in the US, which has sort of been catching up. And so now we're at this moment where, after having a bit of a US focus for the last few years, we're going global with what we're doing. And it's, again, thinking about this interaction between the local, the regional, and the national, as we deal with this challenge of how do we create more good jobs for people who comprise the bulk of the labor force, and how do we deal with past disruptions and the disruptions that are to come.
Thank you, Gordon. It's great pleasure to see all of you here for the launch of our Global Economic Transformation Initiative. As Gordon mentioned, this is an outgrowth and, in some sense, the second stage of our program in the Reimagining the Economy initiative, which we started, as Gordon said, a few years ago. And that program, for the most part, we've been focusing on the United States and other advanced countries. And again, as Gordon said, I found myself in the odd position of having been essentially a development economist, thinking about issues about growth and structural transformation in the context of developing countries. I suddenly found that all the questions that I was thinking about were the questions that the advanced countries are now struggling with. It's essentially no different. It's the same kind of issues. How do you create economic opportunity? How do you create, how do you close the gap between the more productive segments of the economy and the less productive segments? How do you move people and resources from parts of the country, from the sectors of the economy that are low productive to the higher productivity segments and sectors? This is exactly the kinds of things that people who are doing place-based policies in the US context worry about, but this is also the essence of economic development and growth. So it's good news if you're a development economist, is now we can truly go global and essentially encompass all advanced countries into our domain. The bad news from the standpoint of the United States, other advanced countries, I guess, is now this is convergence in reverse. their problems have become the problems of development instead of developing countries essentially converging from below. Asim mentioned that we're really at a point of transition. I really believe that is true. On the one hand, we've achieved significant amounts in terms of the overall developmental landscape. I mean, some of the gains in terms of public health, education, life expectancy that have been achieved in the last few decades are just completely outstanding. The economic gains have been more uneven, but even there, if you look at the last quarter century, since about the late 90s or the year 2000, there's been significant economic convergence in most parts of the world. But we are in a moment where we're not so sure where we're going. And I think there's a real sense in which the kind of development model, growth model that had become kind of second nature to practitioners has eroded, and it's no longer applicable. What I mean by that is that, of course, we think about the tremendous success of East Asia, whether it is the post-war growth miracles of Japan, followed by Taiwan, South Korea, other East Asian, Southeast Asian tigers, and of course, ultimately China, and then later maybe Vietnam, all based on a model of export-oriented industrialization. This model, which has been extremely successful in terms of generating very rapid economic growth through structural change, while fundamentals like education, governance, infrastructure, and so forth are being accumulated, is no longer really working for a variety of reasons. And it's not just because Trump is playing havoc with the real world economy. It's much more fundamental about the nature of manufacturing industries, the nature of global value chains, the demand they place in terms of basic capabilities and skills and capital requirements. And as these sectors now have become much less of a kind of a broad-based escalator for economic growth, the real question becomes of sort of what's the future model of economic growth for the developing world. I think there are essentially two new lines of structural transformation that successful countries and those of today and of the future are going to be going through. One is almost by necessity the green transition, the movement towards green industries. And here the good news is we've had a remarkable revolution in technology and innovation led largely by China, the renewables revolution, the significant collapse in the price of renewables, solar, wind, electric vehicles, and batteries. And that has provided significant opportunities for developing countries, including some opportunities for green industrialization. And we'll talk about that in our various panels. The second line of structural transformation, which is very different from the past, again, making something that's necessity turning into an opportunity, is the transition into services. Because whether we like it or not, the bulk of jobs that are being created in the urban areas in the developing world today are being absorbed into urban services, mostly non-traded, mostly low-skilled labor absorbing, everything from street vendors to micro enterprises to food service workers, another type of, and we need to figure out a way how to turn these jobs into more productive, good jobs. Here again, I would say we've had some good news, which is to say that even though we associate these kinds of services with very low productivity, precarious work, there is, in fact, a lot of evidence from around the world, and we'll talk about some of that in the panels to come, that in fact, it is possible to increase productivity in services. And this is already happening around the world. In the last 2 decades, in the United States, productivity in services like restaurants, retail, has actually increased more rapidly than in manufacturing. This has also been the case in some leading developing countries, including India, about which we might hear a little bit later. There are opportunities there. that one can use. The third piece of good news, and here I'll come back to what's something that Gordon and Asim both said, is that if we can simply get away from the kind of pessimism that pervades the world economy with what's happening, decline of multilateralism, the reductions in foreign aid and so forth, and look at what's happening on the ground, there is tremendous policy experimentation, policy success that's really happening, and we can build on that. And that's why it's so important for us to bring the practitioners around in this room, along with the academics, together to discuss these issues. So I'm going to be moving to our first session right away. Before I do that, I do want to say a few words of thanks to people who have played a big role in making this thing happen. First, Asim, as director of CID, along with Fatima Sumar here, they played a fantastic role, along with Katie Doyle, Val Krampus, and Katrina Mahoney, all from the CID. Thank you for your help. The Wiener Center, where the Reimagining the Economy program is housed, Barbara Whalen, it's amazing, executive director, fantastic. Thank you for your help. We've received support from the Hewlett Foundation for the Reimagining the Economy program, and now more recently from the Open Society Foundations for the Global Economic Transformation program. Thank you from the Open Society to Lauro Carvalho, Louis Godoy, and Dilia Kuto in particular. Finally, the Reimagining the Economy team, Gordon and I lead this along with our co-director, Rohan Sandhu, who's been amazing. Thank you, Rohan. Montse Okanya, who's helped us a lot. And last but not least, special word of thanks to Thor Blanco Reynoso. Where's Thor, who's really been amazing in terms of arranging all the logistics. And I think everybody who's traveling has already encountered that. So thanks a lot with that. Thank you all. So let's move on right into our first session. This is going to be a little bit slightly different from the next two set of panels. So I wanted to start out with just an overall framework to sort of lay the stage about sort of at least one of these axes of the new axes of structural transformation we've talked about the role of services. So I wanted to ask the authors of a fantastic paper that was recently published, Fabrizio Ziribotti and Michael Peters, who are here from Yale, who did extraordinary work on the services transformation in India. And now they're going to extend that work into sub-Saharan Africa, so we'll hear about that. Highly germane. Also want to invite Doug Golin, who is going to be their discussant. So please, Fabrizio, Michael, and Doug, thank you for doing this.
Should I start? Keep going. Keep going. Well, thank you very much for inviting us, and it's a great honor to address this great audience. And thanks also to Danny, who has made it easier for me to get started, because he has already introduced what I'll be talking about today. Let me say this is a joint work with Michael and also with Yudan Zhang, a grad student at Yale. And it is about a development pattern that has been quite pervasive, at least from the start of the new millennium, where growth and structural transformation takes place without major industrialization. So our mindset is staged by the observation of something that has happened since the days of the British Industrial Revolution, in both the today industrialized and the developing world for decades and decades, whereby, well, we have initially a decline of the agriculture, which frees labor force that moves to industry, and then industry grows, and then economies mature and manufacturing sector starts declining, and we start observing growth in the services. So this has been for a long time the pattern, but if one looks at the more recent decades in the developing world, and not so much or not at all in China, not in Vietnam, but yes, in India and in large part of the developing world, as I will show you, we have a transition directly from agriculture to services. What kind of services? Well, one thing, service is a very heterogeneous aggregate. So one tends to think of ICT, finance. Well, if you take developing countries, the bulk of that transition is more prosaically in areas like retail, hospitality, leisure, health, perhaps. So services that have two characteristics: they are consumer facing and they are non-tradable. And many of them are provided in specific location and in large part in cities that become some type of service hubs. So this raises a series of questions. First of all, is this rise of service a cause or a consequence of the growth process? Second, to what extent it's associated with unequal incidence and unequal benefits, both across space, because if you live in a city, you have the advantage of the city, but if you live in a remote area, you don't, and between rich and poor households, because we know from the data that the consumption of this type of services varies a lot. Third, is this a source of creation of good jobs, or it's mostly disguised unemployment of people who try to be there and to get better jobs? There is, again, a tradition in development literature to think that this is just a wait stop toward that path. And finally, can this be sustained, or is it something that we can observe, but then after a while, there is no more potential for growth? In our previous work, we have tried to answer this by proposing a methodology that will say something today with an application to India. And now we have moved the focus of our analysis to Africa. So Africa is, it's a big continent, and there's a lot of heterogeneity, of course, within Africa. But there are also very important areas in which economic growth has been fast, starting with about 2000. So if we look at the period between 1970 and 2000, altogether, we have always been discussing of takeoffs in other parts of the world. Now we have important regions in Africa where growth has been a reality for almost a quarter of a century. And we have actually first created two clusters which have the following characteristics. First of all, they are in East and West Africa, respectively. These countries have grown at an average rate above 5% in terms of GDP growth, a little less if you look at, or less if you look in terms of GDP per capita growth, and yet remarkable both in absolute level and if you compare with the experience of the 1990s, for instance. East Africa is definitely growing very fast, but even these countries in West Africa have definitely increased their growth rate. In these nations, in this part of the world, the process of structural transformation has been very different from what we have observed in East Asia, and somewhat similar to what we have observed in India. So just to give you a number, on average, employment in agriculture has declined by 8 percentage points over the total employment. And of these, 15 percentage points have gone to services. Only 3% have gone to manufacturing. I want to say that I want to talk about these countries But it's not that these countries are special, like India is special. These countries are the average pattern. If anything, Vietnam is special. So if you look at these graphs, I don't want to spend too much time on specific details, but you see how much the change in employment in agriculture has gone to feed employment in services relative to manufacturing. And the services is the lower and the manufacturing is higher. So flat means very little, steep means a lot. It's not only this set of countries, it's all countries, fast-growing and less fast-growing countries. This is the typical pattern of development in the 2000s. If you look at the spatial variation, there are also some interesting observations. So here, I'm separating rural and urban regions. And what you can see by comparing the beginning, this is 2000 till 2012, because that's the period for which you have microdata, but it has continued after that. But it gives you the sense of the trend. In rural regions, these regions are and continue to be highly agricultural. There has been a decline in the employment in agriculture. It is almost entirely absorbed by services, very little by growing manufacturing. In urban areas, of course, the picture is already different to start with. There is less employment in agriculture, but again, the bulk is increase in services and in private services. So it's not a story of the governments growing, to the opposite, governments, if anything, decline in relative term. Here is the picture of Vietnam for contrast. So you see Vietnam over time, the time horizon is also slightly different, but it's this sharp decline in employment in agriculture that is absorbed mostly by increase in the manufacturing sector and also by services and incidentally by different type of services. And I want in fact to go next to discuss what type of services have been growing. Here within the service sector, we are dividing into three categories. The first is what we call consumer services. That's retail, hospitality, health, local, non-traded. The second is finance, business, ICT. And as you can see, completely inexisting still in rural Africa. And, there is some growth in urban Africa, but it's still relatively small. Transportation, we have separated because, it's not entirely consumer-facing, it's not entirely producer-oriented, so you can see it. So the biggest increase comes from these like traditional services. Okay, so let's reflect on what's going on. We can have two polar views about how to interpret this. The first is that this growth of non-tradable services is largely or even exclusively driven by demand. So what would the story be? Well, there's somewhere there has been productivity growth. Maybe some countries have benefited from a good situation in raw material prices. Incidentally, we have excluded oil-producing countries from our count precisely not to emphasize this or to de-emphasize this. And, this growth in the tradable sector have made people richer. And because people are richer, they demand the services. The services per se do not provide any productivity growth, but they grow because of this demand effect. Okay, so according to the story that we call service bias growth, service growth will be a corollary of tradable productivity growth. That's a pessimistic story to some extent because, if then manufacturing growth is not large, this is not destined to last. A less pessimistic view is that non-tradable services are actually more than that. They are a growth engine, so they can be provided under increasing productivity, and they generate to some extent their own demand, and more than that. So as the countries grow and people become richer, they spend, as we observe in the data, a disproportionate amount of their demand on of their income on services, and so because the services become more productive, people become richer and they demand more of those. And so this would create somehow a circle that potentially has some hope to be sustained to some extent, at least over time. Okay, so which view is right? In principle, if we had the ideal data, we could tell. If it's demand effect, we would just see growing prices of consumer services because everything else becomes cheaper to produce, but services don't. If it's a productivity story, we should see the opposite, the falling price of consumer services. So that seems something we could ask the data and get the answer. The problem is which prices? It's not clear which price we should look at because it's not well defined what a unit of services is. So this is one bottle, these are two bottles. But when we talk about services, it's not so easy to make a count, especially because there is a lot of heterogeneity over time. Think about the supermarket or the corner store. Well, the corner, you could just go and compare the price of the more sophisticated supermarket or the corner store, or Amazon versus going to the shop. And you would say, well, it's not just that the value that is created is to sell the bottle of water at a different price, maybe lower, maybe higher, but it's also, the variety, the reliability of the service, the quality of the storage. So all things that for which people are willing to pay a price, and so they should enter as a count of the value. So in the prices we measure, this adjustment is very hard to make. It's very hard to make in the United States, and it's even harder when you try to get the price in some remote county in India or in Africa. So we would like to know the answer. Is this productivity growth or not? And the way we go is to provide a completely different way to estimate that by using a structural model. So somehow we try to ask the following question. People are willing to pay something for those services, and then we can use the data for employment and the data for productivity in the tradable and productivity and human capital. And then we can use some restriction that the theory imposes to actually infer the productivity growth in services. I will try to explain in a moment how we do that. So this model will allow us to identify demand and productivity effect. And there are two key elements for the identification. The first is that these consumer services are non-tradable, and so the markets have to clear locally. And the second is that under some assumption that may be very strong, but still we should be willing to make it, we argue, macro demand elasticity can be inferred from microdata. So one of the things that we want to promote is the idea that we should have a common language in micro and macro. Too often we have spoken, to different questions or to the same question, but from very different angles. Okay, so I won't plunge now into model details. So I'll try just to give you an idea of how the story works. First of all, we want to, of course, to have heterogeneity. So we want to have rich and poor people, and we think that people have different exogenous productivity that can come from several sources, from education, from whatever. Then we want to specify people's preferences because the transition, the structural transformation is to some extent related to the demand phenomenon that I discussed before, and specifically that as people become richer, they spend an increasing share of their income on services. We postulate a particular class of preferences that is known as Pigel, that was introduced for the first time in the 1970s, that has an appealing feature for this idea of having micro and macro using the same language. It features aggregation. So we can, from the knowledge of the micro demand, through some equation, go to the macro level demand and learn about the property of the macro demand. In general, that's hard. In general, it's not possible. And many times we use the homothetic preferences or simpler system of preferences like Stonegiri that quantitatively are a non-starter to answer these questions. That's the first ingredient. The second ingredient is that we think that all final goods are produced by combining tradable goods and non-tradable services. When I say tradable goods, you can also include tradable services. So the production stage may have as part of its input finance, ICT, and all those inputs are counted there. And then we have a separate category that are our consumer facing services. And different goods have a different intensity. So, hairdressing services is very intensive in the consumer service part. Rice in the market is very intensive in physical inputs. So we have an heterogeneity there, but also a mapping that allows us to go from the final goods to the value added of different large aggregates. Here, for simplicity, I'm going to just distinguish tradable goods and non-tradable services, but you could have agriculture, manufacturing, industry. In fact, that's how we did it for India. What is the main result we exploit? The main result is that you can go from individual demand of final goods to aggregate demand for sectoral value-added aggregates, and you can do it in a way that retain the properties of the aggregation property, which means, first of all, that when I look at the expenditure shares, they have the same representation at the micro and at the macro level. There are different parameters, and the macro parameters in part reflect the structure of economic inequality, as that equation shows, which I won't go into detail. But most important, there is one parameter, an income elasticity, the parameter there called epsilon, that is something that you can infer from the system of demand for individual final goods, and then transfer to the demand for sectoral value-added aggregate. That requires making some assumptions, but under those assumptions, we can use the information that is widely available from microdata in order to inform our macro exercise at a level that is, if you want, abstract, but less abstract than what we do normally in macro models. Okay? So there is a key equation that we then use, and it's an equation that relates the demand and the supply of consumer services in each local market. So when we did it in India, we did it at the level of individual counties, because there is a lot of disaggregated data that can be used. In Africa, we've done for the moment just a distinction between rural and urban area. But let me try to give you just the idea of this. On the left, you have the supply. So the supply of these consumer services is the number of workers. So people supply those services, so we can count those. On the right-hand side, we have the demand. The demand comes from the demand system I introduced before. And of course, that demand depends on the income of the different agents and on characteristics of the distribution. But most importantly, if I know all those productivities and I know the individual human capital, I can generate the extent of that demand. And I can do so under the assumption, suppose, for instance, that we take the first view of the world, that there is no productivity growth of consumer services over time. Well, then that left-hand side will tell me how much the demand for consumer services will grow. I match the demand and the supply, and they are generally, I'm sorry, I should have. And they are not the same, okay? So the additional part would come from the productivity growth of consumer services. That is the part that this equation identifies. So if we see that we have a large supply, a large employment in the consumer services, yes, I'm asked to be quick. Let me give you at least the results of that I want to emphasize. First of all, we find that productivity growth so estimated in consumer services in our African country is actually higher than in the tradable sector. Again, in line with something that Danny was saying before. The second fact that I want to emphasize is the welfare consequences of this. So once we have measured that at the level of each individual community, we can go and ask people, how much would you be willing to, how much income would you be willing to renounce in order to go back to a situation where that productivity growth is not observed? And what we find is that there is a lot of heterogeneity. So the blue line represents the welfare effect of the productivity growth in the tradable sector, the yellow one in the non-tradable consumer. Let's start first from the rural versus urban area. In the rural areas, most of the welfare gains come from the productivity growth in the tradable sector. In urban areas, it's instead very important, the consumer services. And when you go to rich and poor, you see the difference that richer consumers have a high, richer consumers benefit much more from the growth of the productivity in the consumer services relative to poor household. So there is this element that there is high productivity growth in consumer services. B, the benefits are heterogeneous, and they are very much concentrated among the rural household, among the urban household, and more for the rich than for the poor. Okay, so in the second part, but I'm seeing a lot of messages that suggest that I should stop, but let me at least advertise this. We have started thinking about sources of productivity growth in this consumer service part. And, we will be happy to have maybe in the open discussion. We think that there are reasons why this can be important through agglomeration externality, through the reduction over time of labor market friction, and through micro improvement in the technologies that also benefit informal workers like the street sellers. Having an iPhone, having a bank account have a very important effect on the productivity of the services that even this basic service producer can offer. Won't have time to talk about that. Let me just say, we can use this framework to talk about many other things like international trade, internal migration, green transition that was mentioned before. And we think that this can be actually done very fruitfully, and in other projects, that's what we are doing. And that's my concluding slide. Consumer services play a key role in today's developing world. There are a lot of open questions. Is it cause or consequences? Well, our analysis that we think provide, some useful insights suggests that we shouldn't be so pessimistic as perhaps we have been at some point. Service growth can certainly contribute to sustain long-run development. We have provided a framework that can, give a measure to that. And we hope that more research will come to complement our work. Thank you, Essar.
I'll take it.
You need this.
I will need this. Thank you so much. While I'm waiting for slides to go up, here they are. Just say it's an honor to be here, and thanks to Danny. And thanks, the opportunity to discuss this paper, it just seems exactly right for a conference on reimagining economic development. And so what I want to do today is stay at a fairly high level. I think, first of all, I just want to say this is really important integrative work. It brings together a lot of different strands of empirical work and theory. Fabrizio didn't go into tons of detail. I think the points that I would want to emphasize for the audience are first that I think it's a moment where we're challenging this very long dominant view of structural transformation as always involving this kind of linear progression from agriculture to manufacturing to services. And so I think the paper links a lot of different dimensions of this, thinking about both sectoral movements, spatial patterns of development, the distributional impacts, extensions to informality and formality, discussion of human capital accumulation and its role. So I think this is a really key paper. I think it also represents a change within the academic literature on the growth process, which has taken up the idea in the last few years that maybe we need to reopen these old models about how structural transformation takes place. And so I want to stay at kind of a high level, just talk through a few things here. I think, again, this is a paper that is motivated by a very rich set of questions and puzzles that are facing all of us, both in academia and in the policy world, as we think about what the growth process is going to look like for countries that are still relatively towards the beginning of it. And I think there's a great roadmap here for future research. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to look at the preceding paper that Fabrizio and Michael and a different co-author have written on India, which is has made the case that contrary to what a lot of people imagine, the growth story in India has not entirely been driven by producer services, by tradable, exportable services, but by these same consumer services. And I think that's an important precursor paper. This paper extends that observation from India to a set of African countries. And there's a comparison with Vietnam that I think is interesting. And again, I think it's a great structure, a use of a purpose-built model to think about a particular set of questions, but then to provide a framework for a bunch of further work. In relation to the policy conversation, I think the question that comes to mind very much is whether, I hear this a lot when I go to sub-Saharan Africa, policymakers are very worried that the opportunities to participate in this old model of industrialization doesn't seem to be there. And the question is, as Danny's written about premature deindustrialization, this paper is arguing that service-led growth has been central to the growth experiences of a set of African countries that are actually doing pretty well. It's delivered meaningful improvements in living standards. So it's not just a kind of second best or third best outcome. I think the argument here is that there's something going on here that we need to think much harder about. We also need to think about the distributional consequences, which are not neutral. In some sense, I think there's an existence claim here that there is potentially another model beyond the one that we've all taken for granted. It's not necessarily saying that this is a more desirable model, but not obvious that it's a less desirable model either. And so I think the question that's lurking there for all of us is this model of growth driven by consumer services, is this a good model? Is it a more desirable model? Is it a less desirable model? Can we achieve economic miracles of the kind that we've seen in the past? And I have a colleague who likes to ask, can countries grow just by doing each other's laundry? And I think that's a question that many of us kind of have in the background, even in the face of evidence that, in fact, actually that's what most countries today actually do. The US grows by doing each other's laundry. That's what the service economy is, in a sense. And I think the question here maybe invites being broadened out a bit. And so I would like to make the case in the couple of minutes that I have left that maybe we've been thinking too much as economists, and maybe especially in the policy world, about sectors of activity. We worry a lot about what goods people are producing or what services people are producing. We worry about sectors maybe more than we should. Sectors aren't necessarily all that well defined. There's a lot of, right, we use a kind of tripartite division of the economy that's based on kind of a 1930s view of the world, in which services is a kind of grab bag category that includes a lot of different stuff. And so I think we have to get past that. The question, right, there's this old mentality that the service sector is the low growth sector. And yet we know that this isn't true. You know, you think about retail, people talk about retail as a consumer facing service that doesn't have potential for growth. Tell that to Amazon or Walmart or Carrefour. These are sectors where growth potential is high. the question that we should be asking is what is it about the manufacturing sector that we've always assumed was important? And can we unpack that and think about which pieces of that are important? Is it the tradability of manufactured goods? If so, there are some services that are tradable. Is it about scale economies? Well, Walmart and Amazon would suggest that those are present in services as well. Is it about the standardization of output? Retail food services, like McDonald's, is either a manufacturing company with lots of plants. That's not a put down of McDonald's, but it's either a manufacturing sector or it's a service sector that's producing highly standardized products, and so scalable in a different sense. Is it high productivity? So I think trying to unpack what it was that we always assumed was special about manufacturing and asking where those things apply in other sectors of the economy. I think that's where we ought to be going. Stepping back to the level of countries rather than sectors, what do you need for a country to grow? You have to have some source of productivity growth, some sector or sectors that are growing in productivity. Productivity growth is a piece of the story. You need a sector that generates some kind of mass employment, and you just need jobs. In Gordon's discussion earlier, we need to know where the jobs are going to be, and you need probably some sector that's going to generate foreign exchange earnings. But I think the trick is it's not essential that those all have to come from the same sector. So an economy that's generating foreign exchange earnings from primary products, mass employment in services, and productivity growth in some mix of different sectors of the economy or some subsectors of the service economy, that seems like a perfectly workable model. And I think we should be open to reimagining the structures of economies and how things grow. I want to come back to something that's an important feature of the paper here, and that I think is more general, which is that the spatial integration of the economy, mixing rural and urban economies and putting them in contact with each other. Urbanization, these are kind of fundamental spatial features of economies. And I think the fact that market integration is a kind of central part of the story here is important, and is something we haven't necessarily taken as seriously as we should. I'm talking about market integration primarily within domestic economies in low-income countries. And so I think this paper has agglomeration effects in cities. And if you think about it, one of the issues in low-income economies is that many households and communities are kind of especially in remote areas, kind of quasi-autarkic. They're producing much of what they consume, and they're consuming a lot of goods that they produce themselves. And so integration into markets, as well as integration of markets, plays a role in driving the growth process. Because it's the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations, I felt obliged to flag that Adam Smith already knew this a long time ago. I won't go through the quote, but he lists this wonderful example you've all seen about sort of what goes into the woolen coat that the day laborer wears. And I would just flag that in addition to the various manufacturing steps in here, merchants and carriers, and some of these are services and some of these are goods. And market integration of goods and services production is kind of central to a Smithian view of how economies grow through specialization, the extent of the market, and so on. I'll close in the next minute or so by just saying I think we should be looking beyond broad sectors. And I think there's a whole additional set of dimensions of structural transformation that should be back in the conversation. This paper touches on a number of them, but the spatial dimension, the movement of people from rural to urban, and the integration of domestic markets is a key one. The change in the locus of economic activity, the movement of activities from home to market, with kind of huge gender-linked implications, is another piece of this that I think is central. Changes in the nature of work and the firm size and structure, from self-employment to wage work, large firms, the development of large firms, still not something we see much of in sub-Saharan Africa. Changes in the legal structures of production, changes in demography. And so I think, in a sense, all of these things matter for growth. I think this is a really positive message for a conversation about reimagining development. I think it suggests that there's a much broader range of policy levers that we can rely on, things that we wouldn't normally have thought of in the conversation about where growth comes from. A lot of micro policies become macro. Policies around labor force participation, policies around women's land rights, policies around formalization. All of these things become macro salient. And so I think it's a positive message that there's much more than just policies around how to promote export manufacturing through foreign direct investment. So I think this paper plays a really important role in challenging what I think of as a kind of continuing fixation on manufacturing. And I think opens a lot of doors for further research, for policy, and I think lots of extensions still to be explored here, but really an important contribution to the conversation. So thanks very much.
I'm going to kind of MC here for a moment, if that's okay. And hi, I'm Fatima Sumar, everyone. I'm the Executive Director here at the Harvard Center for International Development. I just wanted to reflect really quickly about some of the conversations and what a powerful way to kick off this conversation. You know, so many of us, how many of you, just quick show of hands, how many of you are working in countries or regions where you need your economy to grow?
All of us.
Okay, and how many of you think, actually, Doug, to your last point, that FDI or aid is going to bail you out? No one? All right. So what I'm saying that actually to really underscore an important point here, that one of the things, you know, if we think about the path from poverty to prosperity, for so many decades, we really talked about industrialization, and that really being the engine and really looking at the work of manufacturing and the role of manufacturing here. This idea that as we think about what investments we're going to make in economies, we have to start thinking fundamentally different about what's going to create jobs for people. And we're going to have to look more creatively in services, both in rural and urban areas. I think is a real pivotal point for us to think very deeply about. I'm a policymaker, I'm not a researcher. And I also want to say, I think these are the types of conversations for my policymakers in the crowd and practitioners in the crowd. We have to be thinking structurally different around as well. So I just really want to appreciate Doug, Fabrizio, and Michael, the work that you all have been leading, these contributions. And it really kind of ties us into our next panel. And I think what I'll do, with your permission, is you guys are around today, right? We're going to kind of keep continuing the conversation, including at a reception tonight, where we're going to have source a lot of these conversations. So please do find each of them, read the paper, translate the paper also to the policymaking crowd. And please, we'll keep that conversation going. So big round of applause to each of you. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to help us transition, and I'm going to keep an eye on the clock because we've got a lot to cover today. I'm really excited because this is such a beautiful transition now to our next panel. You know, the global economy, one of the things that we're all seeing is the global economy is changing much, much faster than our institutions can keep up. How many of you are thinking and focused around job creation in the economies that you're working in or the countries you're caring about? I hope it's all of you, because that's going to be the number one challenge that we're really going to be thinking about, is going to be job creation at scale and what that's going to look like, particularly in the age of AI. So I'm really excited to introduce our next panel. And so please come on up as I introduce you. It'll be moderated by Gordon Hanson. Gordon, come on up. And joining him are four extraordinary voices. Of course, we have Haroon Borat, who is the Professor of Economics and Director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. It's a real honor, Haroon, to have you. Thank you for being with us here today. We have joining us Marcela. Where's Marcela? Oh. We have Marcela Eslava here, who's a professor of economics at the University de los Andes in Bogota and the president of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association. It's great to see you here today, Marcela. Celestine, a longtime friend at CID, faculty affiliate and visiting professor at Harvard Kennedy School. Many of you, he's known here actually just as Prof. Is that right, Isita? Is that right? Okay. Celestine is the former vice president and chief economist at the African Development Bank. He's also one of the principal architects of the new structural economics and co-editor of the Oxford Handbook on Structural Transformation. Always great to see you, Celestine. And we're very honored to have Raghuram Rajan with us, the Catherine Dusac Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at Chicago Booth. He really needs no introduction, the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India and former chief economist of the IMF. It's a real honor to have you. And last but not least, Amir, you're nice and big on all of our screens here, so we can all see you really well. Amir Labdioui is the associate professor of political economy of development at Oxford and director of technology industrialization for the Development Center. Gordon, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fatima. When we think about global transformation, global economic transformation, we have to understand where we're coming from, we have to figure out where we're going to, and we have to figure out how to get there. And this is an all-star panel that's going to help us navigate that journey. We're going to start with Haroon, who's going to help us understand the tricky economics of moving away from coal. And it's tricky, not just because it's hard for economies to make the transition from fossil fuels to new sources of energy, but because the people and places are involved are often not the people and places that might be the center of new economic dynamism. When we also think about where we're coming from, we have to think about the low productivity traps in which economies often find themselves. And Marcella has done landmark work understanding the origins of those productivity traps and how we discover new sources of dynamism. So we're moving away from old energy and we're moving away from low productivity. Where are we going? Well, Amir is going to help us think about green industrial policy and the role of green technology in new sources of economic opportunity. And then Raghu is going to help us understand, in the Indian context in particular, more about the way in which services can be a foundation for growth. Now, in charting all of this journey, we have to figure out what economic tools do we want to use and what economic tools might we want to leave by the wayside. And so providing that panorama on future economic directions, Celestin will help us think about what economic frameworks we really want to have at our disposal. Okay, so we have a lot to cover because we're going to transform the global economy in an hour and a half. I'm giving each of you 5 minutes to make your pitch. Then we're going to have some back and forth, and I really want to reserve time for Q&A involving the audience. So Haroon, let's start with you.
All right. Thanks very much, Gordon. I can confirm I've never been on a panel when I had 5 minutes and no slides, but Gordon's given us 2 slides, which I'll share with you. So in many ways, the COP28 zero net emissions target by 2050 is an overarching goal, but embedded in that is that 40% of that goal can be achieved if we move away from coal. So coal seems sort of, one esoteric sort of mining town kind of element, but in essence, actually, it's key to how we think about the green transition. There are a few key economies, and in fact, Danny mentioned in his introduction, China being known for its transition to green technologies and so on, but 60% of energy usage in China is dependent on coal. And that's true for economies such as India, such as Vietnam, and my own country, South Africa, Indonesia, and a whole host of others. So in fact, sitting in the sort of zero emissions goal, right, to 2050 is what to do with coal and how does one think about the transition away from coal. And so a lot of the work that we've done, and if I could have the slides up, I'm not sure where they are, a lot of the work that we've done is within the context of South Africa and for the Presidential Climate Commission. And I want to talk about 2 specific elements that I think are important when we think about coal and the just transition away from coal. The first is that as you move away from coal, there is a concentration problem. Coal is not like any other industry, and in fact, you can think of other mining elements where concentration is critical to how you think about the transition. So in the South African context, if you look at the map, that's the map of South Africa, the black triangles, if you can see it, is where coal is concentrated in the country. It's a regional labor market. It's a regional economy when you think about coal. We have 100,000 workers in the coal labor market in South Africa, which at the aggregate sounds a little. It's 1% of total formal employment in South Africa, but it's close to 85% of all employment in that little spot of South Africa, which is called Mpumalanga in a single province. And that's true for every single coal producing economy I've mentioned, whether it's Vietnam, Poland, going back in the UK and so on. So the just transition policy discourse sometimes can get lost when we say, when I have 2 minutes left, when we say, you know, this is a small employer. Well, it's regionally concentrated. So you better be thinking about location-based policy. You better be thinking about regional spillovers and the coal town problem. The second is the mismatch issue, which I don't have a slide for, but in essence, the giveaway from the sustainable development argument has been, well, a lot of these workers will get absorbed into renewables. That's not true because of two mismatches. One is the location mismatch. So if you look at the other dots that I've got on that diagram or the map of South Africa, that's where all the renewables investments are happening. Those workers in Mpumalanga, in the coal industry, are going to find it very difficult to move for all sorts of reasons to where renewables investments are. The second is a really key one. I call it the 10-year mismatch. Renewables investments are intensive in the construction phase in terms of employment. It tapers off dramatically after the construction phase, both in terms of number and in terms of skills type. There is no way coal workers can find secure long-term employment in the renewable space. That's overall considering the general skills mismatch that you find when you look at the coal labor market. And so the work we've done, which is my second slide with 1 minute left, I'm interested in seeing how the other panelists do, is work again for the Presidential Climate Commission is to say, well, if you understand the coal labor market just in terms of individual characteristics, takes the age and take the occupation of workers, right? I'll give you one simple example. If a coal worker is 63 years of age, and 90% of them are male, is then going to be facing coal market closure. The policy instrument you have, because you've identified their age, is in fact early retirement and the whole series of options available. But if they're semi-skilled, maybe you need to think of education and training. If they are unskilled, maybe you need to think of social assistance. And so what we have on the slide deck are these 4 key instruments that we vary by intensity and duration. So we can give a social assistance scheme support to a coal worker, but maybe only for a year. And maybe it'll be 100% of the wage and so on. And so what you have on your right is a switching on and off policy framework that we've handed over to policymakers in the coal industry. And if it looks and feels like the beginning of an app, it is, and it will be, that's the next phase. The idea that you can think of integrated, switchable policy interventions for coal workers. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Haroon. So we'll come back in a few minutes and think about this issue of policy sequencing and its importance. Marcela, moving on to you. Robert Solow famously said that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything. And your work has taught us that in Latin America, it's pretty much everything in the short run too. So as we're thinking about where this problem of generating business dynamism and in economies where it's been lacking, and then in the broader global context in which declining business dynamism is now a problem that afflicts high income, middle income, and low income countries, what should we be thinking about?
So we should actually be thinking about not only productivity growth and the growth of these economies, which has been lacking, but also about the joblessness of that growth. And so I want to bring to the conversation these emphasis on jobs that some people have brought about. My research has been mostly on Latin America, so let me talk from that edge. But the data are very much consistent for, in general, middle-income economies and lower-income economies as well. So in Latin America, 50% of the workers are outside labor protection. An even larger fraction of those will never get a pension because they spend a lot of their time in informality. And that's very related to the fact that the vast majority of them are in self-employment and micro enterprises, and not only large enterprises, but also small, medium, and of course the large enterprises. Now, the paradox is that those larger, small, medium, and large firms do generate most of the value, but little of the jobs. And that means inequality. So you have the larger part of the tart divided among the fewer workers. And so that's a reason for great concern. So even when you do get growth, that growth is not absorbing the people. So of course, that has to be one of the emphasis going forward. And one question is why you need a diagnosis to sort of deal with the problem. There are basically four main sources of this. One may be just preferences, like these guys in these countries, for some reason, prefer even more self-employment and micro-enterprise employment, and there's good reasons for that. You know, the autonomy, for instance, of managing your time, hard transportation in these economies. There's also the technological gap. These economies are adopters, not innovators. And as a result of that, they may be implementing the technologies where they are already very labor saving, like say very automated, for instance. So that's one possible reason. But then there's two things that we can do more about. And those are, one, low human capital for a lot of people at a level that perhaps is not compatible with their fitting in these more modern types of firms with better technologies. And then secondly, and very importantly, labor market frictions that perhaps are keeping people from being able to move to those higher productivity businesses with better income to offer. So in recent work that I've been conducting with Laura Alfaro, who's the chief economist at the Inter-American Development Bank, and Martin Mestieri, and then a former student of mine, Felipe Sáenz, we're finding that all of those are important in Colombia, but only closer to 30% of that is either technological or preference driven. The largest part has to do with the mismatch between human capital and the abilities needed. And I'm not talking about technical skills. I'm talking about basic skills. Given the labor market frictions that you have to overcome to be able to get to these jobs. Say, in some countries, Colombia is one of those cases, not every country in Latin America, minimum wage that's way above the productivity of a very large fraction of the people. And then thirdly, other regulations and other, we call them distortions, that are a higher burden on the highest productivity firms, which are the ones that would be able to perhaps absorb more people. And then I was saying 30% of that is preferences, but the other part, the largest part, is this human capital, and about 20% is these other distortions. So this brings like key lessons for how to address the problem. Of course, it's telling us human capital has to be a huge emphasis. Now, our experiments in a lab economy sort of point at the fact that if you have productivity growth leading growth, that may not create these jobs if the human capital that's associated to that is not in the current bottom of the distribution. So the people who nowadays are farthest from those abilities, that's the part of the population where these interventions need to be focused. Again, I'm not talking about giving them particular technical skills, which are going to not be that useful when they are replaced by, say, AI or other technologies, but about general skills. Then the second important lesson has to be the reduction of barriers. Some of these barriers are regulatory in nature, and at the very least, we need to be conscious of how costly some of those are to avoid continue raising those. And of course, there are direct stimulus, for instance, that can be introduced, where the key feature is going to be the where to focus those hopes. So I'm going to stop there, and let's talk about it later.
That's great. I think we've seen in both your remarks and in Haroon's remarks the challenge of mismatch. That is, we have people in particular places or sectors, and we need them in other places. And that poorly tuned policies can mean that we will do nothing to help resolve that mismatch. And you're both thinking very hard about how we better tune policies, and we're going to very much come back to that issue. So now, transitioning, Amir, to where we're going, you've been thinking and working hard on the role of green technology and green industrial policy in helping make this happen. We have lived through several green industrial policies in the United States in the past 6 years. This is a contested area. It's a challenging area, but what's captivating about it is the way in which almost every country on the planet is thinking about green energy and green technology in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you, Gordon. I hope you can hear me well. Super. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. Gordon asked us to give a 5-minute pitch. So I will focus on 3 main messages for green industrial policy. But I will use the story of 3 sports to lend the messages across: boxing, curling, and football. First, as I'm sure he's not expecting to be quoted on the green industrial policy debates, but the great Mike Tyson once said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And I think that's very much what has happened with industrial policy in the United States and in many other countries around the world. And this is for a key reason. Industrial policy is essentially about long-term planning, right? With results that are going to be delivered in a long time horizon after 10, 20 years in sectors that are highly vulnerable to internal and external shocks. And that's even more the case for green industrial policy, right? There's the pace of innovation around green technologies is very rapid. Every year, we're seeing breakthroughs around different types of technologies. Only 9% of green technologies have reached technological maturity. That means that we should expect more disruptions as time comes back, even with batteries. No one today can tell you that in 10 years, whether in 10 years it will be lithium-ion batteries, solid-state batteries, LFP batteries that will dominate the market. And those are batteries that use different production systems, different types of minerals. So there's just a lot of uncertainty to deal with. But as you mentioned, developing countries, in fact, many developing countries have very good-looking green industrial policy on papers. I can hardly think about a country that doesn't have a green industrial policy strategy. But the problem is those plans tend to be quite rigid, right? And this is one of the huge difficulties that I think we don't talk about enough. How do you plan for something expecting shocks in the process? And I think this is where some countries have done particularly well. And I'm thinking especially on the East Asian side, where you can see that there is a plan B, plan C, and they're not just betting on one technology, but they're actually expecting shocks and counterattacks by the incumbents, which, by the way, I mentioned the tech disruption part. It's also market shifts. It's also regulatory changes. A guy can decide to put tariffs on the rest of the world, right? Where you expect your exports to go to. So that's part of the game. What does it mean for industrial policy? That's why I would like to turn to curling. So in bowling, and maybe I think most of us have indulged in bowling, you throw this ball and you expect that down this very long corridor, it will hit the target, right? But with curling, you don't really, I wouldn't even pretend that I watch curling or that most of us are into it. You know? I think only the Scandinavians are really into that sport. But there's one thing about it is that they don't leave it to chance. They have those sweepers that you might have seen that try to adjust the trajectory of the disc over time, right? So it reaches the target. And that's precisely the institutional arrangement that has often been missing in industrial policy strategies when things go wrong, right? The capacity to readjust the trajectory in the face of changing circumstances. And so this is a great challenge for developing nations because you need strong capacity for technological foresight, to kind of understand what technologies are emerging, which ones are declining. You need strong institutional mechanisms for monitoring and evaluation of industrial policies. We're very used to M&E mechanisms for health, for education projects, but it's not really standard for industrial policy. And I can think, again, of a few countries that have tried to embed those in their plans. Malaysia, the Economic Planning Unit, also has that mandate, right, in terms of revising strategies over time based on what works. China is obviously a wonderful case, but I won't even dare talking about China knowing that Yuan Eng is going to be on the next panel, so she can give the deeper examples. And the last part is about football. Why? Because frankly, the type of green industrial policy that we talk about, in the last 10 years, green industrial policy, it's mostly very large economies, both in the global north and global south, that have been able to do it, right? China, Brazil, India, US, EU. But if you're Togo, if you're Cameroon, if you're Algeria, if you're Guatemala, it's very hard to rely on the same type of policies which have been tilted on the demand side, because your domestic market is just too small to be able to shift standard and reach economies of scale. And this is where regional coordination is more important than ever when it comes to green industrial policy. So with my colleague Baptiste Albertin, who's actually here in the room today, we've developed this model where we look at it through game theory. And what we come up with, looking at historic experiences across the world in terms of regional industrial policy, is that the supranational model is often not the one that leads to successful outcomes. Because industrial policy is a matter of national sovereignty, right? Governments need ownership. But if you have a supranational body, whether the EU or the African Union, telling governments what to do, they can put a vision, right? But they're not really having the buy-in and ownership of countries that have to implement. So instead, the kind of multilateral coordination through coordinating agents, more resembling what ASEAN has done, which based on flexibility, on a kind of negotiated division of labor, tends to be more successful. And what we had proposed is a model in which that agent doesn't really tell governments what to do, that institution, which will differ across countries, but only identifies the duplications of efforts and the shortfalls. Everyone wants to build a regional supply chain, but everyone wants to build the exact same segment of that regional supply chain, right? Every country in the global south wants to be a green hydrogen hub, but there's a limit on how many hubs they can be. And so instead, by providing this information, governments can then readjust what makes sense for them, right? In terms of reaping the areas that are not yet oversaturated. Why did I mention football? Because when you try to put a competitive football team, you don't just get only strikers in your team, right? You need profiles that are complementary, that are different. And I think that's the part of the regional coordination of industrial policy that we haven't gotten right yet. And yes, I know it's dangerous to talk about football. Celestin is coming next. Celestin and I have had frictions in the past as his country had kicked mine out in the World Cup, but I felt comfortable bringing football back because now mine is qualified for the next one, but his isn't. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Amir. I wasn't exactly sure where that was going to end up when you started talking about multilateral institutions to coordinate things. I was worrying that you might put forward FIFA as a model for how we bring countries together to do things efficiently, but we didn't end up there. Raghu, let's turn to you next. And so if we think about 1991 as an important milestone in India's economic development, at that moment of economic opening and liberalization, many would have thought that, well, we're gonna see another kind of manufacturing-oriented process of export-led development, and India surprised the rest of the world. I'm guessing India probably surprised itself along the way. And so you've written in very eloquently, and including in your most recent book, about how services will and should continue to be the future of economic development in the country. And I think what we heard in the earlier panel is both an eagerness to embrace non-manufacturing oriented strategies for economic development, given all the concerns about that sector's capacity to support growth, but also some concern and confusion about, well, how do you actually do it?
Thanks. Thanks, Gordon, for having me. This is based on a book with Rohit Lamba, Breaking the Mold. We wrote in 2023. We didn't realize how much work was going on the idea of services. And I mean, ours was more a advocacy piece saying India doesn't have to go through the manufacturing route. in part because we could already see the growing protectionism. There wasn't really a room for another China, India's China's size in terms of population, having another manufacturing giant, both from a sustainability perspective, but also from a political perspective, was just impossible. But China also was not leaving, much as the flying geese model worked in Asia with the leaders, Japan, Korea, sort of leaving the low-skilled industries for the others and others following their footsteps. China is the entire sort of flock of flying geese. It occupies both the advanced sectors as well as the unskilled, low-skilled sectors. There's not that much room in manufacturing anymore with the way China is proceeding, including because of the broken model it has on pricing. And finally, if you look at this vaunted low-skilled manufacturing, such as assembly, it's no longer dependent on people, it's dependent on machines. Look at a cell phone assembly plant in Delhi. It's one machine after another. And the people it hires are either people to transport stuff between machines or people to repair the machines, which is a higher order skills. So I think when we talk about manufacturing-led growth, where is it? What's the place for it? There's not a huge amount of scope for that anymore, which is why I think countries have sort of drifted into services. What Danny called premature deindustrialization may in fact be the only option countries have, and they've moved into that. Now, India has, I think, to the point Professor Golan made about you need a foreign exchange generating sector, productivity growth in generating sector, and a jobs generating sector. It has managed to do that in services. There is a very high skilled service sector. Formerly it was software, etc. Now it's moving to consulting, legal services, etc. JP Morgan has 4,000 lawyers in India doing their contracts. So this caters directly to the world, made easier after the pandemic because of the ability to communicate more directly. It's also services that are embedded in manufacturing. Think of design. Chip design is actually a big thing in India. We have 200,000 chip designers working for big corporations. This is also the place where labor arbitrage happens today. Arbitrage at the high skill level, it costs $250,000 to employ a graduate of a business school here. It costs $50,000 in India to get the best business school graduates. And so they are being employed by firms. Of course, the big question there is, what will AI do? Who knows? We hope some of it will augment labor. Some of it will displace labor. Hopefully, there will be a whole lot of new jobs also created because of AI. I suspect, as always, some combination. But it's not special to services. It will also occur in manufacturing. The second aspect, so this is the foreign exchange and productivity growth generating sector. The second, by the way, I should note that soon after the book, India's services exports crossed manufacturing exports for the first time. India exports more services today than manufacturing. On the labor creating side, that export sector will not create a whole lot of jobs, maybe about 6-7 million today. But for the bulk of Indian jobs, it has to be what Professor Ziliboti was talking about. It has to be moderate skilled services. But there are enormous possibilities there, especially given that the average Indian village is about 5,000 people, or that's the definition of Indian village, which is a small town everywhere else. So India is largely urbanized, something the UN recognized by saying it's 80% urban today. Lots of scope for services ranging from plumbers, carpenters, construction workers, tourism, hospitality, etc., but also capability creating sectors like education, healthcare. There is enormous scope there, and we're seeing some of that emerge. For example, we're seeing firms take Indian handicrafts from the craftsmen to a global market. And it's the service part which does the bridge, but there is a manufacturing part which is traditional craftsmen. I want to give an example of another kind of firm, Lenscraft, which actually brings eyesight to a lot of Indians who wouldn't go into a shop to get their eyes tested. This entity sends people to people's houses to measure them. That's the beauty of having low-cost services. You can actually send people all over the place, but it also has the ability to manufacture in 2 days the kind of specs that you want. And Lenscraft says we can compete with China as far as customized manufacturing goes. We cannot compete on standardized manufacturing. And what they've done is created they employed 15,000 people today. They've created an enterprise based on customized manufacturing, but also customized services. None of this is to say that you should discriminate towards services at the expense of manufacturing. You should let whatever happens happen. But I think underlying everything, whether it's manufacturing, services, or even rural industry, is the need for capability building. And that's where India needs to do far more if it wants to grow. We worry a lot more about building shiny chip factories than thinking about building new educational institutions which will create the kinds of designers who already do very well in the global market. We want to enter the chip business where, we've seen China sink hundreds of billions of dollars without reaching the frontier, where we've, the sort of table stakes are huge, while neglecting some of our specialities such as high-tech education, the IITs, etc. We need to invest far more in the right places. And that was part of the reason for the book, saying we don't need to get fixated about manufacturing, but let's work on things where we actually can make a difference and can have a different path. So bottom line, I think India has to focus much more on the cognitive stuff rather than building more concrete stuff. And I think that implies what Professor Sen has always advocated for, more capability building. Human capital is the place to go. And we need it all across, right? From dealing with malnutrition at the very young level, to better schools, to better universities. Let me end by just talking up one, well, I'm out of time. I was just thinking about, some of the enterprises we saw. One was a place called Orchid International, which tries to build high quality schools. The problem in building a high quality school is it takes many, many years, a Phillips Academy, for example. But can you get to 90% of a Phillips Academy and at scale? What this place does is essentially figure out what lesson plans are, 30,000 lesson plans, which it communicates to teachers. Now, a well-prepared teacher who has a lesson plan, follows that lesson plan, and is backed by technology can actually do well, even if they're not that good. Basically, they're supported very well. I'd hate to teach like that because it's very regimented. But for the average teacher, it makes them very good teachers. And if you have a school with a lot of good teachers, it becomes a very good school, because we can all think of our schools where we had a large mix of teachers, some very indifferent. So what Orchid does is it teaches 350,000 students by sending these lesson plans, franchising it across schools, and teaching a lot more students. What it has done is elevated the average quality to becoming really quite good. And my sense is we need to do more of that. But this is an example of the kind of service-oriented businesses which can scale, which has productivity growth, and which has actually increased capabilities, which I think is the central problem.
Thank you, Raghu. What we've seen in 3 of the 4 presentations is that as we're imagining this transformation, new approaches to workforce development are going to be absolutely essential. And the good news there is that we've had a tremendous amount of experimentation going on. The challenge is, as Amir raised, is the right institutions that can spread that knowledge to the right places. How do we replicate entities like Orchid across the skills distribution and in geographically? And Celestin, it raises the question of who should we be looking to for policy guidance as we imagine what industrial policy will become. Your work on the new structural economics has pushed the profession in directions that it's been quite resistant to, but a lot less resistant to today than 10 years ago. So if we think about when Made in China 2025 came out, to many it seemed like an anachronism. Today, it seems possibly more like the future. So how do we think about where should we be looking for guidance in terms of how countries conceive of their industrial policies? And then related to the issue that Amir raised, who are the multilateral bodies that should be leading that effort?
Thank you. First, I'm very happy to be here and want to thank you, Gordon and Danny and the team for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to share the panel with Raghu Rajan. I was at the World Bank when he was chief economist at the IMF. I learned a lot of economics from his work, but I have some small disagreements with what you just said. This panel is about transforming the world. I guess the first metric we should look at is where do we stand on the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which is basically the agenda that the world set in 2015 to transform itself. Well, as we speak today, less than 4 years before the 2030 deadline, the SDGs are largely off track. The institution, including UN institution measuring progress towards SDGs, are saying that about 18% of the goals will be achieved, even though there's been some progress here and there. So we are largely off track on our main metrics for transforming the world, which means we really need to stop and think and rethink. I'm very happy to hear industrial policy back on the agenda. The World Bank just published a major report. I remember when I worked there with our senior economic advisor there for chief economists, one of them, when he mentioned industrial policy, he was accused of being a communist by his own staff. So it's good that the bank has reflected on that. It's even more impressive to me that the IMF organized last year an important conference in Washington on structural change. An important part of it was on industrial policy, and a volume is coming out in a couple of days at MIT Press, 500 pages by the IMF on industrial policy. So it's good to hear that. But then the question is, what precisely are we calling industrial policy? That's really the question. Everybody talks about industrial policy. My own work, I've tried to compute and collect and see how people define industrial policy. There are many different definitions. Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of Treasury here in the US in 1791, defined industrial policy as government measures to boost manufacturing. More recent definitions, they can be nuanced, but they come to basically one thing. Government policies that intend to change the structure of the economy. That's basically the definition. Well, but it makes sense until you think seriously about it. Any government policy intends to change the structure of the economy. Now, some people will say, well, no. There's something called vertical industrial policy that will focus on a sector, a particular industry or particular firms. That's bad. You should advocate broad horizontal policies that touch everybody. Conceptually looks nice, but in practice, really meaningless. And I'll give an example. The most neutral macroeconomic policy, typically nobody sees it as industrial policy, is monetary policy. Okay? Well, but yet we all know, if you work in a central bank, you know that whatever monetary policy you choose, will favor some people and have winners and losers, will favor particular industries, sometimes particular firms. When you choose an exchange rate, you know that it will change the structure of the economy. So any macro policy is actually an industrial policy. In fact, every single item in a national budget is intended to change. The question then becomes, well, what do we do? And what role do we assign to the government? How do we generate growth? How do we sustain growth? Speaking now for the last minute or two about Africa, which is 1.5 billion people, and I don't see how you can transform the world if Africa is not transformed. So Africa has to be at the center of this conversation. Well, there is something which I would call like George W. Bush used to say, low expectations about Africa. So when African countries have 5, 6, 7% of GDP growth, we think that that's great. It's actually quite miserable. When you take into account population growth and you look at GDP growth per capita, well, there's a long way to go. It will take all these countries, most African countries, current GDP per capita in Africa today is 2,000. About the same thing in India. Well, if Africa grows at the nice growth rate of 5% a year, if you take out population growth, it will take Africa about 30, 35 years to double its GDP per capita to reach Venezuela's GDP per capita today. Okay? Or Djibouti, or Vanuatu, of $4,000. So we need to be bolder. And the way we are bolder is to first focus on what industries work well. Where do we have comparative advantage? Where do we make a big difference? Now, services certainly can contribute, but I don't see any progress if we don't take industrialization seriously. And manufacturing, the big jobs, certainly the big sources of growth for the next 10, 20 years have to be in manufacturing. Energy, okay, the green transition, all of that is mainly manufacturing. But I will say one more thing. The definition, the classification, the boundaries between agriculture, industry, and services are very blurred, and they are shifting. So I would not even use those categories too strongly, because a lot of services are actually linked to industries and manufacturing, including AI. A lot of agriculture, if you want to raise productivity, it has to be agro-industry, it has to be industrialized. So the boundaries between the sectors are shifting, and we need to take that into account. I don't want to keep the floor too long, but we can come back and have more specifics.
Well, this is great. I think folks have already kind of organized themselves into two groups on the policy issues that we want to discuss. That's not Celestin versus everybody else. We'll leave that for the World Cup. But we have industry with Amir and Celestin giving us two different perspectives on it, and then we have skills. So I want to start with the skills issue, and then we'll move to the industry issue. And we'll just kind of with Haroon, Marcella, and Raghu giving us some thoughts here. Haroon, you raised this issue of developing a policy menu and then providing folks guidance in terms of what items on the menu that they should choose. So that means that we've got to have the policy capability of creating the right menus and then getting delivery in an expeditious manner. So how do we pull that off? Marcella, you talked about this essential features of skills building. I think when you were emphasizing you're not training folks for technical stuff, I took that to mean an emphasis on on soft skills, in part. And what we have learned in kind of lower end labor markets in the past few years is that returns to soft skills are very, very high. Low at executive function excludes people from opportunities for work. And so if we think about who's going to be doing that skill imparting, what are the actors that should be involved? One of the things I find so interesting about Latin America right now is that so many countries in the past 10 years have made upper secondary schooling mandatory. You now have a set of institutions that are kind of positioned to do new things. And if it's not them, who might it be? And then Raghu, on this issue of services, India kind of spans the distribution in terms of education quality, having some of the very best technical training, and then in particular with primary schools, some training that leaves a great deal to be desired. This kind of the middle skills component is enormously important if we want to avoid service-oriented economies that look like New York, where we have investment bankers and management consultants and other high-end business service folks, and then low-skill folks who just make their lives easier. So, Arun, please.
Yeah, so I mean,
I'm sorry, just to be consistent with my incredibly rigid timekeeping for the new global economy, take 2 to 3 minutes to come up with the answer.
I thought we'd get away with the time check. But just to step back a little bit about the policy focus. So what we had done in the work for the Presidential Climate Commission and for the President through the Advisory Council was to say, let's first understand what the coal labor market looks like. Just the basic sort of labor force survey descriptive overview by age, by occupation, by gender, wage benefits, non-wage benefits, and so on. And that became the entry point for saying, well, then you have out of that the anchor for bespoken policy. Because the policy discourse before that in South Africa was, well, this is a social protection concern. So what you've got to do is look at the 100,000 coal workers and let's look at our social assistance budget and see if we can afford to pay these workers the equivalent of their wage for the rest of their life. Fiscally unaffordable. However, if you look at, as I said, a 62-year-old coal worker, he is a prime candidate for an early retirement instrument, right? So that becomes the check in that grid that I had for that worker. But if the worker's 25 years old, so they're still fairly young and they have some sort of training, but there's a training gap. It's sort of Raghu's point about there's a training gap. Well, then there's an instrument available, education and training support. You need to be careful about what training you're offering, but that's the instrument, not early retirement, and certainly not social assistance. But if they are unskilled and the likelihood of that individual finding a job is close to zero, social assistance comes in. You bound all of this by the budget. And then the fourth one is the relocation mismatch problem, right? So you can then offer the incentive of, well, we think you can find a CFO position in a renewables firm away from where you currently live, and we will pay the relocation subsidy. So out of that unfolds these four instruments that by age and by occupation can be switched on and off by the policymaker. So the policymaker gets to make those choices that are bound by either the institutional imperatives, so the coal mining companies. Incidentally, the coal mining companies are nowhere in this conversation. It's very interesting. Who could afford to pay the early retirement out of the Provident Fund scheme, or bound by the budgetary imperatives that the National Treasury brings to bear. For me, that becomes a really interesting and important entry point for a policy discourse that folds out of empirical analysis to say, well, the policymaker now has this menu that they can actually switch on and off depending on the characteristics of the workforce within the particular coal company. And seeing that Gordon hasn't stopped me, let me just add one sort of plug for what research can offer is that on the skills mismatch, the difficulty we had was this crude, well, how does the coal mine operator become a solar panel technician? It turns out that, if you do this sort of crosswalk from the ONET code, so some of you have worked with, I'm a labor economist, so if you've worked with the task-based measures from the ONET data, you know that you can figure out the tasks that are common across occupations. You can then build similarity indices between tasks that coal workers do relative to tasks that individuals, say, in renewables or other sectors do. We've done that. And it turns out that there are a whole bunch of jobs in the solar panel industry, but in renewables that are very closely related to the tasks currently being done by coal workers. That's the entry point in the sort of financing of the green transition to say, hang on, let's body check the sort of job loss and say there's a transition that's possible in the terms of agreement towards a green transition. And if we, in the COP28 discussion, to say, well, these are the workers that we could potentially redeploy into the renewables industry based on the research we've actually done.
So that sort of tuning is really worth close examination. Something we haven't mentioned is the policy and political implications of getting it wrong. In 1990, when the U.S. extended the Clean Air Act, and that was going to put in place legislation that would lead to substantial job loss in coal mining. Congress elected at a vote that lost by a one vote margin not to put those sort of policies in place to help coal miners make the transition, and that's what moved West Virginia from being a Democratic state to a Republican state. The U.S. senator who cast that deciding vote was Joe Biden, as it turns out. On tuning, Marcella.
Okay, so let me first, I wouldn't want to boil it down to only education or even skills. It's the mismatch between the requirements that you have to access a high productivity job and the skills that are out there. So that is to also say, because skill formation takes possibly decades to really change in a structural manner, you need to also pay attention to all of the other restrictions that create that high boundary compared to the abilities of people. And that means taking care of labor market regulations that can be forbidding for some people to enter. But of course, the skill part is going to be crucial, is what's transformational in the long run. And so in that sense, yes, I was talking about soft skills as a key ingredient, partly because the particular training is so hard to tune. It's like it's the dog chasing its tail, in the sense that the particular training that you always need is always changing, and it is very hard to be, from a policy perspective, chasing what those changing skills are. So that added to technical change and the fact that soft skills become ever more important. They have always been important, but they become ever more important. Does put an emphasis right there. Now, on what to do and who's in charge. The good news, I guess, is that this is one place where, of course, policy is crucial. There's a lot to be done from the public space, but there's also space for the private sector to contribute from demand, but also from the provision of different forms of training. And I think Rago was given a nice example on this. These countries have gaps in coverage, and the expansion, say, of high school coverage is crucial, but they also have crucial gaps in quality of the training, and importantly, on the emphasis that we give on training. So if I think particularly of Latin America, if you think of educational policy for primary and high school, and even also for tertiary education, much of the policy is highly prescriptive. So here are the things that you need to teach. Much farther from this emphasis on what are the key soft skills that you put upon. And let me add one other feature of Latin American public policy that is very present. To me, it's surprising that its emphasis in terms of particular skills is so much on entrepreneurship. For a region where you have in some countries like mine, 45% of people being an entrepreneur, that is to say, being in self-employment. And so when you put that focus, you're also moving away from the skills that are needed for good employment. So that's on the side of the don'ts and where to change emphasis. So let me stop there.
So let's, Raghu, let's continue that discussion with who might do this. As Danny and I have been understanding different actors in the place-based policy domain in the United States, we ran across a group that innovated active labor market policies, and where you combine sectoral training with these sorts of soft skills, and also working closely with the training providers, often in the US community colleges, and with employers. The shocking thing to us is that those innovations happened 30 years ago. Kennedy School actually gave a medal to Ernie Cortez, MacArthur Genius Award winner. So the idea of what to do has been around for a long time. Scaling and replicating has been a challenge. So then as we look to the Indian context, are we thinking public sector? Are we thinking private sector? Are we thinking something new for that middle skill development?
Great question. We don't have clear solutions yet because we're struggling with the same problems. In fact, additional problems. One is the traditional Indian way of skilling people is you follow your boss around, absorb as he goes and does stuff, and eventually he lets you do something. It's a very poor way of learning because you don't learn modern technologies, etc. You're about, at best, you can be as good as he is, or typically a he. And that's not very good. The quality of urban services is abysmal and of high variance. Call a carpenter if you find one to your house in India, and you'll see what I mean. So there needs to be more systematic training. The problem is the people who most can benefit from this training, typically people who've been educated to a high school or even a college level. A lot of the college degrees aren't particularly high quality, so they are ripe for learning trades, but there's a huge sort of stigma to working with your hands. That's the part that doesn't exist in the US, but it exists in India. If you're working with your hands, you're at a lower status level than somebody who works in an office with their minds, or even somebody who's sort of tootling along on their motorcycle, delivering something in 2 minutes. That has higher status than working with your hands. So we need to change that. We need to change the status of professions where you work with your hands, but we also need to improve the training. There are some examples of successes. Orissa, the government of Orissa changed its whole vocational training and capability building process. That was a one-off. It worked well. It involved things like getting industry to come in and saying, these are the skills I want. I'm willing to provide the machines. I'm willing to provide instructors, help some of the local training institutions build those capabilities, but we need a huge amount more. The government announces training schemes ever so often. They sort of hang around for a little while and disappear because there have been very few successes in doing it properly. We need absolutely to focus on this and to spend more money. Last point I'll make is that's one set of things we need to do far more of. The other set of things is, research and development at the university level. If India wants to sort of be a player in many of these new services areas, it needs much more highly trained people, but all accompanied by a lot of research and development. One of the things to emulate in China is what they've done on that front over the last 20 years, how they've built world-class universities, but also world-class research establishments. India, like China, has a huge diaspora it can call on, and it can help build this. Doesn't do a great job there. We need to do better.
So let's move from skills to industry, and Amir and Celestine, put you two in conversation with each other. I wasn't sure whether you're saying different things or focusing on different sets of policy challenges. So Amir, I heard you talking about the need, one might think of as the need for humility in a world that is rapidly changing, where energy prices are fluctuating, where major economies are having substantial shifts in economic power, where the OPEC cartel turns out to have a dynamic membership rather than a fixed membership. Figuring out how countries make long-term bets can be a big challenge. And Celestin, you were all in on being bold. So if we think about kind of this corner of green industrial policy, but then Celestin, to your point, perhaps more traditional industrial policy and a focus on manufacturing, how do we think about some of the principles that should guide that in an incredibly uncertain and volatile world? Amir, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Gordon. And I do want to clarify that you have put Celestin and myself back on the same team, which is in the industry team. I agree with what Celestin has said. I think what really needs to be bold, and what I was trying to say is that boldness requires adaptation. In a way, I think it's very useful to go back to evolutionary economics to try to make sense of the way that government can best intervene in today's world. And I think there are other reasons to support what Celestin has said for industry. One is that there is a high level of path dependence. So talking about what I know best, which is green industrialization, if you look at the countries in the developing world that are managing to build revealed comparative advantage in green technologies, almost all of them are doing so by using their pre-existing manufacturing capabilities. Not their critical minerals, not their large population size, is their pre-existing productive capabilities. So Mexico venturing into EVs, they have a pre-existing automotive assembly sector. Brazil, which has managed to build wind turbine quite competitively, but the technology that they needed to build wind turbines is actually very related to the technologies they developed for airspace, right? We all know Embraer. Malaysia is the second largest exporter of solar cells in the world, but that's mostly thanks to the fact that they had a pre-existing electronic sector, and the technology to build electronics circuits is very similar to the technology you need to build solar cells. So in a way, if you don't try to join that race, you're really jeopardizing the future. And this is really the kind of complexity of industrial policy. And I know I used sports metaphors to make my point, but I think there is a deeper justification here, which actually borrows from Danny Roderick, who had explained really well and really elegantly that industrial policies can fail, it's normal, and they should be evaluated on a portfolio basis, similarly to venture capital, right? It's really about the kind of the few that really succeed that make up for the losses. And think about it over the years, I realized that actually it's not so much venture capital, which involves an element of knowledge at a particular point, but more like a sport. Because there is learning by doing, not just in the sector, but also in the policy making itself, right? It's not just an art, it's actually a sport. Because the more you do it over time, the more you learn how to do industrial policy well. So I think this is why I would make a strong plea for governments to actually keep doing it, perhaps diverging a bit from the newly found Washington consensus, perhaps, that industrial policy is fine, but not so much developing countries because they don't have yet the capabilities to do it, so they should be careful. But actually, the more that they do it, the more they learn and acquire those capabilities to do it well. So perhaps that aligns the two sides on the industry and skills, because there's the skills part of what you promote with industry, but there's also the skills involved in doing industrial policy well.
So, Celestin, Amir gave us a vision of industrial policy that would support big investments in manufacturing, but starting from an existing set of capabilities with a goal of then advancing into particular sectors. You gave a vision that was more expansive than that. So if we were thinking about then building out that complete industrial policy, in addition to what Amir mapped out, what else would you have on the list?
Well, I think that all countries in the world can successfully produce something and be good at that thing, regardless of where they are. But you need to be careful what kind of industry you want to get into, or you want to promote, or you want to support. And that has been in my view, the main problem. Many developing countries have attempted to promote and support and fund industries in which they could not really compete. And they spend a lot of money, subsidies, protection, the old structuralist framework. And then, sometimes they grew for a few years, they even created jobs, but it was not sustainable because they couldn't really keep it up. Now, one of the reasons why I'm strong on industrialization is that we've seen in many developing economies, many poor countries, the kind of service focus that we are promoting here. In my own country, Cameroon, but in Egypt, all over the place, a lot of the government and even private sector activities has been into services which are very low productivity and low skill services. And that's a trap. Now, service, of course, can be a strong source of growth and transformation. But what kind of services? The one that Raghu has indicated, like banking, computer, IT, and so on, but they require a lot of education and training. You don't have that currently in the labor force that we have in Africa, and I would say even in India. India is about 700 million people in the labor force, at least. Well, I don't think if you look at the structure, the skill set in India, you would have people there who are ready to compete successfully in the kind of transformative services that we're talking about. So Danny Roderick wrote 10 years ago this premature industrialization paper. I think you should write an addendum on premature servitization, because some countries, some countries have jumped and are jumping too fast into services, and what you have is street vendors and call boxes and so on, which help people survive, but that's not going to transform the economy. Only manufacturing can transform the economy. Now, I know Raghu has said that China has kind of confiscated even the low-skill manufacturing. I think that's is being challenged by the empirics. China is relocating a lot of industries for one reason. The number one problem that every single Chinese businessman is telling you in China today, we see that in all service, is the wages going up. Low-skill labor in China today, more than $1,000 low skill per month. So China cannot stay and cannot confiscate low-skill manufacturing. And some neighboring countries with the right policy framework, including, of course, Vietnam, but even Laos, even Indonesia, some countries that do not necessarily have great political ties with China, they're absorbing and relocating and having through foreign direct investment, some collaboration with Chinese firms. That's possible. Now, in one sentence or two, quickly on your question, Gordon. Well, first, we need to create the demand for skills. We've been talking a lot about skills. I can tell you that many African countries, from Algeria to Morocco to Egypt to Cameroon to Kenya, have spent a lot of money producing great people, and then, well, these people have nothing to do and they leave. Okay? Egypt has been training hundreds of thousands of great engineers. They are all over the Middle East and Asia. The same applies, I won't even mention Nigeria. I won't mention Kenya. So yes, skills, training, very important, but the demand for skills, how do we retain that capacity? The problem is not capacity building, really. It's capacity retention. And for that, you need first to have the industries that absorb the skills, that the expertise that you're producing. You need to select them. You need to target them. And you need to then deploy a set of macro financial policies to support them, but they have to be transparent, targeted, and temporary. And of course, the use of special economic zone, industrial parks. This is not a Chinese instrument. It will use all over the world. It will use in Italy, Ziliboti, in the 1920s. It was used, the first modern special economic zone was created in Ireland, in Dublin, Ireland. So it's not a Chinese instrument. It's just common sense. Industrial parks, special economic zones allow you to solve in a particular geographic area the governance issues, the infrastructure issues that you cannot solve in the whole country at once. That's basically their purpose. So industrial policy is just good macro policies, but targeted to industries which can compete.
We're going to have a brief interjection by Marcella, and then we're going to take a set of questions from the audience. So be ready with your questions. I'm going to take them in a group of three and then present them to the panel.
No, I just wanted to react to this question of whether it's demand or supply for skills, which is definitely a crucial question. When I was saying that what we found is that you can have growth, which means productivity growth and growth of good businesses that could demand these people, but you could have it without job creation. The problem is precisely that when it's productivity driven growth, then you can grow without having to absorb more people. And so that's the reason in the end that the skills have to come first if what you have is a mismatch between the skills that you already have and these demand that you could later have.
Great. Do we have microphones in circulation?
Thank you. My name is Kingsley Morello. I'm speaking tomorrow on the afternoon panel. Former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. I just wanted to make a quick comment and to say that in this room, it's not just a team of two, Celestin and our brother Mayor. There's a third person in the team, and that's me. Because everything that Celestin was saying, I was jumping up and down. No, serious, because we understand our reality in Africa. And I think this conversation raises the importance of nuance, in economic policy and the whole conversation about development, and that we should be very careful about received wisdom from the West or from Asia when we are dealing, for example, with some other parts of the world. So I didn't have a question. It's just I just wanted to cast a vote. Thank you.
Excellent. Next question from over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Marceline Kofi Ale. I work at the IMF board. Mr. Mogalu just said that there are three people on the team. I'm not part of the team, but I'm a fourth member somewhere. I'm happy to be here to see Celestin, to see Rajan, our former chief economist at the IMF, to see Professor Daniel Rodrigue. I'm a big fan of Professor Daniel Rodrigue. He wrote a piece a few years ago on Project Syndicate, the manufacturing imperative. Professor, I've been reading over and over again this piece. And I want to echo everything that Celestin just said. I'm sorry. The service you're talking about, I don't see them in Africa. The high technology based services, we don't have even internet services to do those things in Africa. We need manufacturing to do the economic transformation all over Africa. A few weeks ago, I was at the IMF board, kind of fighting with some of my colleagues, because the IMF issued a report about low-income countries. 2 years, the 2025 report and the one in the 2026, there's one main takeaway. Countries that have been doing well in Africa are diversified economies. They are the countries that have been making some step in terms of economic transformation. Everything we are discussing now about the cutting of official development assistance, the high debt, and all these things, I think is very important, a very important debate. But diversification, economic transformation, manufacturing is the engine that we should be focusing on. Services will come later. Please, for now, let Africa work on manufacturing. And as Teresa was saying, China has been doing a lot. We congratulate China, but there's still some room for us. Thank you.
Great. So we'll have one more super quick question.
Thank you. Regarding the conversation on precisely quality work and just transition, I think there's a topic missing, and that's gender bias in work and the care economy here, because one of the reasons why also there's a gap between employment and people that are going to be employed is precisely that many women cannot actually go either to study or to work because they're taking care of someone. And that's something that also gives an opportunity towards a new branch of economy, that's the care economy. And it also, if we don't address that, a lot of women and a lot of people will not actually enter the workforce. And that's something that I would like for you to comment on and discuss on how that's going to change the work landscape. Precisely in Latin America, I think that's one of the main issues right now, providing inequality, mainly for women, but in general. Thank you.
Great. So Amir's sports analogies turn to be spot on, but it's not Algeria versus Cameroon. It's manufacturing versus services. So I want to give the panelists an opportunity to reflect. Raghu, we'll start with you. And we're under a little bit of a time constraint, so let's be super pithy in giving your final statement.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I don't think the point is about favoring services or favoring manufacturing. You create environments and then something happens. But just on the issue of industrial policy and favoring, India has been trying industrial policy to favor manufacturing since 1970 or 60s. In 1980, our share of the manufacturing share of the labor force was 13%. In 2026, it still is 13%. We haven't moved. That's despite 4 decades of various kinds of subsidies, various kinds of targeting, mistargeting, whatever you will. And that's not to say that one has to abandon manufacturing. It's to say that perhaps what one needs to focus on is the underlying capabilities, the underlying zones, basically not favor particular industries, because typically you make a mistake when you favor you typically favor the wrong industries, the ones that look shiny, the ones that look exciting, but the ones that everybody else is doing at the same time. So I would say this would be a pitch for a sort of very loose industrial policy, create capabilities, create the environment, and then let people run. It's old style, I know, but it's the one that has worked. What hasn't worked is, I want a chip industry in my country, and I'm going to build it now.
Yeah, so my dear friend Celestine has poked the bear. So I'm actually going to switch topics, because I was going to talk about the informal economy on this panel. And so I'll give you one example, Celestine. M-Pesa. So M-Pesa is probably the single biggest reason for the success of the modern Kenyan economy, but it's a services industry. It's modern services. And in fact, the overflow into Tanzania and to Rwanda is the entire mobile money revolution. So there you've got a high productivity services sector that's actually generated tremendous growth outcomes in the East African region. We know this. A second factor is South Africa's entry post-94 to becoming the banking pipeline for all the infrastructure deals that are being done in sub-Saharan Africa. So effectively, just in those two examples, you've got modern services that have recalibrated growth rates in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, the new data over the last 2 years shows this increase in growth rates in productive high-tech services. But I do agree that and I don't think the argument is choose one of two paths. I think there is a really important role for manufacturing, but rather than staking one or the other, I think as the opportunities arise, take them. But I think to sort of view services only as informal traders, for which I think there is a role, in fact, for supply side policies, I think we overlook that. But to view it purely as sort of this low road of low productivity, informal services versus sort of competing with China in manufacturing, I think is a false dichotomy.
Amir, we'll go quickly to you.
Yeah, I feel like this conversation is just getting started. So very quickly, 3 micro points. One, which is on matter of skills. One thing that we often forget when it comes to manufacturing skills in developing countries is that a lot of them are in the informal sectors. And these are not skills to bypass. These are actually very good skills to do manufacturing differently than from the incumbents. So one example, so everyone thinks that we have to do green manufacturing, which is, low carbon technology production. But a huge part of the story has to be with material footprint, dematerialization, circularity. And I think many of you, if you try to fix your broken phone in Boston or your computer, good luck. You'll go to the Apple store and there is an institutionalized logic of planned obsolescence. They'll probably replace it. If you try to fix it at Yaoundé or Rio, I don't know how they do it, they'll fix it for you. And I think that's a really interesting skill to do the kind of manufacturing that perhaps there's still room for disruption that the incumbents have not taken full space of. 2, I know I've said it before, but just the regional coordination. I'm really sympathetic to both arguments, but the truth is, for example, on the African continent, 55 nations, more or less all quite small in size, there is a glass ceiling on what each nation can do in terms of green industrialization without regional coordination, putting both on the demand side and supply side assets together to actually build something that is more than some of these parts. It's been done in the past. Airbus is the example. 4 European countries that would not have been able to do industrial policy to compete with Boeing on their own, but they managed to put their resources together to build Airbus. The third point on care economy, we're actually starting work at the Tide Center linking industrial policy with care economy. And there's a lot of intersections there because industrial policy, the type of sectors and activities you promote, that has an effect on gender balance, that has an effect on income distribution, but also the conditionalities that come with industrial policy in terms of childcare, child support, and so on. And lastly, in terms of redistribution. And very last, I'll finish there with another sports metaphor, not to disappoint, that I want to say after Marcel and Celestin spoke. I think that promoting skills development without industrial policy is like teaching people how to fish in a place where there are no lakes. Thank you very much.
So they've given me 2 minutes left. I'm sorry, Marcella, that means 1 minute for you and 1 minute for Celestin.
Sounds good. So just to bring a new issue into the conversation, we cannot forget the fact that partly why manufacturing bloomed is the fact that humanity also started to be richer and it started to demand manufacturing goods. As we progress, people are also demanding more services. That's it. There's a demand constraint that is shaping what we produce and where we go. And I think that's something that opens new opportunities that we cannot forget about. As long as we have the capabilities, the business environments that allow the countries to make the right bets, which could be different, as someone was saying now, different for each country. Those right bets, could flourish.
Final statement, Celestin.
Well, not much, 1 minute or less. Just to say that this conversation normally should take place not here in Cambridge, but in these countries where they need to hear and struggle with these issues themselves. It would be great to have a conversation like this in Kenya or in South Africa or in Bolivia, India. I think that's where things should take place. Now, Gordon, you asked me earlier about the intellectual framework for this. I certainly don't believe that the IMF and the World Bank should be in charge of this. First, it's really not their mandate. The IMF's job is to help you make sure that you have macro-economic, macro-financial balances. It's basically macro accounting, short-term issues. They should not be in this conversation. Yet, all over the world, policymakers cannot do this because the IMF will not agree. And if the IMF doesn't agree, then the sovereign rating agencies will give you a bad rating, and you cannot borrow, you cannot do this to do anything. So I think to end that you asked if there was a multilateral organization to supervise this. I think the regional development banks should be really empowered to have these conversations. I worked for 3 years as Vice President, Chief Economist of the African Development Bank. I was on leave from the World Bank, and I was shocked because I couldn't do anything at the African Development Bank. My board would ask me, does the IMF or the World Bank agree? And I would tell them, I'm the World Bank. What do you need? And they would say, no. Your policy has to be exactly the same as the World Bank. So what's the point of having these regional development banks? They have an identity crisis. I think that they should be empowered to have these conversations.
As Amir said, this conversation is just getting going. We will continue it into the next panel and continue a lively discussion in our cocktail reception later today. Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Okay, can we have people settle down? We're starting now, so for those of you outside, I'm staring at you. Please come inside. I'm going to keep awkwardly staring at people till they grab a seat. And again, if you could come back to your own seats. Celeste, I know you're a star right now, but I want Celeste, bring everyone with you since you're a center of gravity right now. Celeste is a great colleague, so I can do this with him. Okay. So let me introduce our next panel. What I love about this is I'm a microeconomist. And for me, I'm always jealous of macroeconomists because I feel like they talk about the big national stuff and the growth stuff. And I'm talking about like small little skills and local development and so on and so forth. And so for me, this is an especially fun panel because it's giving the local that respect I think it's always deserved, to say that there's lots of local innovation that can happen, which can actually affect regional and national policy. And so I think my other joke is I always feel like macroeconomists know how to study growth, but they don't know how to do it. Because you do know this, right? In macro, growth is the thing you can't explain. Like by definition, it's a residual in a growth regression. So you say, this is great, we really love this, but we don't know what the hell this thing is. And I feel what local actors can do is actually generate the growth that we can. I mean, the challenge with local actors is how do you aggregate up? Right? How do you get to the point that this local innovation happens? And I'd say one last thing. I think there's a mistake we often make, and I want to speak out to the non-state and the non-profit sector, which is I actually think of the non-state and the non-profit sector as in fact the most innovative sector in an economy. And the reason I think it's most innovative is it's neither constrained by the market, which the private sector is, nor it's constrained by policy or public opinion with which the state actor is. And so when you have, I mean, for those of you who met nonprofit actors, they're missionaries in the best possible way. They're driven by some passion, and it's irrelevant if they can't make money for it. It's irrelevant if they can't get the state to buy in for it. But I think that's true unfiltered innovation. My only challenge with the nonprofit sector is that's great, But when some private sector guy or public sector guy comes into you and says, give me a minimum viable product for me to scale, welcome that conversation. Don't be offended by that conversation, because that's going to keep it going to scale, right? So you are the innovation hub, but be open to partnering with regional levels, national levels to innovate. This panel is phenomenal, as the previous panel was. And so let me introduce, so Danny, you already know, Danny has been one of the biggest thinkers in these spaces, and we're lucky to have him here. And I won't have you approach Danny too much, because I'm sure he's oversubscribed. But please do read, talk to him. His ideas are really phenomenal. I'm glad Danny is moderating this session. Let me go in order. So Yunying, I think we're fascinated. We've had a lot of talk on China and what's happening in East Asia. I think we'd love to hear sort of more on how China is doing. From what I've understood is I'm fascinated by within government inter-county competition, for instance, to say how does innovation happen in non just a non-state actor, but in local actors within the Chinese context. I think it's fascinating. Ileana, who I'm thrilled to have again, she's one of our graduates, and so in terms of us imparting skills, we have evidence of that here. So thank you, Ileana, for joining us. I know Santiago is online. Santiago, we miss you, but it's thrilling to have you be here. Arcabe is also online. We're also sort of thrilled to have you here. With that, I'm just going to hand over to Danny.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Asim. Just to reinforce some of the things that you said about the macro divide, the joke about macro that some of you may have heard is that macroeconomists ask the same questions on the final exam every year. It's just that the answers change. And so we are very much aware that sort of, fads and fashions drive a lot of our thinking about policy. We just had a fantastic panel before the break, and I know in some ways we're just going to continue that. I think there was a great discussion that which I think Celestina is right should happen in every capital in a low-income country in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere about how we should think about growth strategy. Should we prioritize manufacturing or services? What does that even mean? Maybe we should just have horizontal policies. I just want to let you know that whichever team you're in, there is some version of me that's 100% with you. And so I just want to start this fantastic panel with just one chart, which to give a bit of background as to where the current me is coming from. And that's a kind of a chart that tries to estimate or project what the global composition of employment in developing countries, excluding China, is going to look like a decade from now. And I've broken this estimate or this projection by distinguishing across employment categories, first on whether they're exposed to international trade or offshoring of some kind, and second by degree of education. And now, especially the microeconomists among you, and this is another distinction between micro and macro, is going to just scratch your heads and said, how did Danny Roderick ever come up with numbers like this? Well, I had a great RA called Claude. And as you know, when you ask Claude a question, Claude never says no. Claude went ahead and produced these estimates. I did do some due diligence, and so I'm pretty confident that this is about as reliable an estimate you can come up with what the sort of future composition of the workforce is going to look like. I think there are couple of things that really come out very importantly here. One is sort of the relative unimportance of those parts of the economy that are subjected or exposed to the global economy, at least in terms of the share of employment. The second is the relative unimportance of broad education, at least measured by whether college attendance or not. That biggest number there, nearly 3/4 of the employment, are workers with less than college degrees and who are going to be largely sheltered from whatever is happening in the world economy. Those are the kinds of people that are in the non-tradable service sectors that we have been talking about. So it seems to me to be fairly clear that whatever your thinking is in terms of future development, you have to have a strategy as to what is it that you're going to be doing with this 3/4 of the labor force. In terms of expanding their capabilities, increasing their productivity, because ultimately development is about structural change. Structural change is about putting people into higher productivity job opportunities. So we have to have an answer to that if we're thinking about development, and that's sort of where my focus has been recently. But we have a fantastic panel. The order in which we're going to go is with Yuan Yang, who's going to start us off, and then we'll move online to Arkebe Okubai, and then Santiago Levy, then come back to Cambridge with Eliana Carranza. Yuan, you've written some of the best recent work on China, but you've also thought more broadly about how the Chinese strategy matters and could be used in other countries as well. So in your first 5 minutes, just give us a little bit of a tour of your thinking.
All right, thank you very much. Well, first of all, my warmest thank you to our hosts at Harvard for having me, and I especially am grateful to Danny for your bold agenda setting. And again, this time you've underscored a long-standing gap in development economics, which is that our assumptions and theories about economics is based on 20th century realities, but the world has drastically changed. And our thinking has not really caught up. And this also applies to our understanding of the role of the state in the economy. In recent years, the pendulum has swung from neoliberalism to industrial policies. One might call that the new Washington consensus. Right? It seems like these days, if you're not championing industrial policies, you're politically incorrect. But the swing to this other end of the spectrum misses a key fact, including in the World Bank report that just came out, which is that governments today cannot easily pick winners like they did before. Okay, let me unpack that. Well, why is that? Because we live in a time of tremendous disruptions, as we have heard from the previous panels. Everything from deglobalization, AI disruptions, the fact that Africa cannot replicate the model of export-led industrialization like in Asia. We're not even sure where the growth engines are coming from, even though there are many possibilities. So in this era of disruptions and uncertainty, policymakers often feasibly do not know in advance what works. And by the time they realize that this industry is winning, like semiconductors, it's too late. And I would say that this is even more true in advanced economies, because today industrial policies being carried out in North America and Western Europe are not driven by the logic of competitiveness, it's driven by the logic of national security. Yeah. So in that world, everything is a priority. Obviously, chips, clean energy, but also lumber, fertilizer, masks, infant milk powder, painkillers, because when your objective is to be safe, everything is a priority. Right? So let's all make sure that we're on the same page. We're living in a very different world. It's very difficult for you to pick winners. So what are the implications of that reality if we accept that as a reality? It would mean that we have to escape a false binary.
And this false binary is that you can only choose between two state models. One is neoliberalism, the minimal state. The other is the maximalist state, top-down planning with industrial policies and picking winners and all that package. And these days, we have to actually ask ourselves a new question. And this question is, what can governments proactively do when they don't know in advance what will work? Okay, so I'll let the question sink in for a little bit because it's an unusual question, but it will be the defining question of our times. Yeah? So I wrote a book 10 years ago to answer this question about what kind of institutions do you design within a government to enable constant adaptation and learning. And that book was in the context primarily of reform era China, which means from the 1980s after market opening to 2012. And the answer that I provide can be synthesized into two words: directed improvisation. Okay? What is directed improvisation? It means that the government does not dictate or pick winners. Instead, the government is like a director. It directs by structuring the conditions for adaptation and learning, specifically in the processes of variation, selection, retention, and niche creation. And these are concepts from evolution, by the way. But let me give you one example of a concrete mechanism for how in the reform era Chinese government, they created the meta-institutional mechanisms for them to govern when they're not sure what the solution could be. And this mechanism is what I call adaptive policy communication. We often imagine that China is a top-down authoritarian regime and it rules by commands. That is incorrect. In fact, the feature of Chinese policy communication is that you can think of it as a signal economy rather than a command economy. And there are three signals that are particularly important: what I strongly encourage, what I prohibit you from doing, and what I am ambiguous about. When I'm ambiguous in my language, I'm de facto giving you discretion to try something out. And the combination of these clear and ambiguous directives provides an adaptive policy signaling function that allows the central government to enforce guardrails, to authorize and scale up, and provide room for flexible implementation and feedback. And what I describe is not a metaphor. It is a mechanism so concrete that you can actually measure it. So my collaborators and I, we have an article forthcoming at the Association of Computational Linguistics, where we use LLM models to measure these ambiguous and clear signals across millions of these instructions from the Chinese central government. So it's something that is actually very concrete. But numbers are not so interesting, so let me turn to some stories on the ground, okay? Let me provide one snapshot from China about how China does industrial policies. Because China is often stereotyped as the Darth Vader of industrial policies, right? This is strong, muscular state. It picks the strategic sectors and then it pauses subsidies, national champions, dominates the world. That's kind of the stereotype. There is some truth, of course, to that story, like Made in China 2025. But when that story is true, it is usually for sectors that are geopolitically strategic but they do not generate mass employment. Yeah. There's a different side of the story. Consider e-commerce. E-commerce. E-commerce is not geopolitically strategic, but China is the world's largest e-commerce industry. It accounts for 50% of global sales. It generates an estimated 50 to 80 million jobs. But let me put that in context. That's the population of Germany. It is the enabler of China's dominance in consumer goods production. Now, given the scale and the importance of such an industry that generates so many jobs and fits the definition of inclusive growth, did the central government select this sector? Right? And let me give you a snapshot. The first central directive related to e-commerce was issued by the State Council in the year 2000. It used the word internet services because it didn't have a concept of e-commerce. And it described internet services as you create web pages and charge for that. Right? So you're gonna get a sense that government doesn't really know what e-commerce is. And in that year, 2000, Alibaba raised its first major investment from SoftBank. So if you look at that snapshot alone, you might think this is a story of neoliberalism, right? The government just does nothing about it. But here's a second snapshot. 7 years later, in 2007, also from the State Council, central instruction, this time to the Zhejiang provincial government and Ministry of Commerce, saying you should set up experimental zones for e-commerce throughout Zhejiang province. Okay, and when the instruction is sent to a provincial government and the Ministry of Commerce, what does it tell you? It tells you there's an integration of vertical and horizontal. Yeah. So in short, did the central government pick winners? It did not, but it discovered it. It took some time, and it also took persuasion. Another lesson we learned is that over the life cycle of this emerging industry called e-commerce, the policy toolkit evolved. You can find everything from benign neglect to building infrastructure to suffocating love. Right? It depends on which part of the life cycle you're looking at. So I'm sure I have already violated my 5 minutes rule, so I'm going to wrap up. So let me again underscore the key point. In the 21st century, we have to confront a new question, which is what can governments do when they don't know in advance what will work? Uncertainty is not a bug, it is a feature. And then we have to ask ourselves, are our theories built for uncertainty? Is our training in public policy schools, in social science, built for uncertainty? Is our research norms built for uncertainty? Is it easy to publish work on theories about uncertainty? I can tell you from experience, no. So maybe these are some things that we need to think about. Because if we want to grapple with these issues, we need a research and training ecosystem. That ecosystem was built for the 20th century. And we need to build a whole new one for the 21st. So I hope that that leaves you some food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuan. That's fantastic. We'll get back to some of the questions that this raises. In particular, the issue of what kind of capabilities does that more experimentalist approach require, and how can it be deployed in other settings besides China? But with that also question in mind, I want to turn to Arkebe. Arkebe, you've held very high-level positions in the government in Ethiopia, overseeing industrial policy. You've been the mayor of Addis. You've also studied China and other East Asian cases. Can you reflect on your experience and your current thoughts?
Thank you very much, Danny, for the invitation. And I find this session quite interesting. The first thing I would like to highlight is the dominant narrative now we'll hear about Africa is all the negative things. And also that industrial policy doesn't work in Africa. And most of the outcomes have been quite failures. However, what I have noticed from my long experience in lived experience in industrial policy, I have been there for 30 years, and also the current research we are conducting on the greening of African economic development, a British academic grant on the greening of Africa, which looks at green transformation and productive transformation. I found, and I learned even what I had not understood earlier, and it's even more. We see some real progress in some industries. So to give you some examples, the biggest phosphate fertilizer producer in the world is in Africa, and it's a state-owned enterprise, OCP, a phosphate rock exporter, which gradually value added, which has now made significant investment in greening and is now the leading player in fertilizer industry. When we look at cement industry, the continent was producing about 100 million tons some 15 years back. And currently it has reached 330 million tons. Significant. The entire industry was dominated by multinational corporations. Now it's entirely dominated, the growth part, by Pan-African investor and domestic investors. Then let's look at automotive. We know South Africa has been a major automotive hub for quite a long time. But if you also see some of the newcomers, latecomers, we have seen from 2012, since the government invested in industrial ecosystem, building infrastructure, targeted productive investment. Between 2013 and 2025, the exported vehicles growth was from 20,000 to 600,000, 30 times, and about 60% local content. And if we look at services, earlier I heard about the dichotomy between services and manufacturing. I'm a strong believer of manufacturing. We have to focus there, but it doesn't mean it excludes services sector. But the key is we shouldn't focus on the informal trading, small enterprise type if we want to make a breakthrough. We have to focus on the high value and that are oriented on the export sector and technology intensive. And a practical example in this area in services is, for me, aviation. Ethiopian Airlines is an aviation conglomerate with seven subsidiaries. And this company had been following different strategies. 2010, its revenue was only $1 billion. In 2014, it became the largest African carrier. In 2025, its earning is going to be $9 billion. And it's the main focus. It's an industrial policy story. And the main focus has been technological learning about infrastructure investment. And it shows this is the most competitive industry. We are talking about uncertainty of our time. That is an absolute fact. What I have learned in the in all this process is that every uncertainty crisis is a source of growth. So Ethiopian Airlines 2020, as we know, COVID, all aviation industry was paralyzed, and they had to be bailed out by every government from US to China. The only airlines that was not bailed out, that did not get a single subsidy, was Ethiopian Airlines. It followed, it adjusted with the environment, changing passenger carriers to cargo, to the new and diversifying. And it survived without any layoff, without any loss, with profits, and up to now it's profitable throughout the years. I'm raising this because, first, industrial policy is a story of industries, a story of success, sectors, and we normally generalize. Some years back, we published How Nations Learn, a book that focuses on technological learning, industrial policy, and catch-up with Professor Kenichi Hono. And our main focus was about to learn more about policy learning, about understanding how nations learn. We know the most famous book, How Nations Fail. We also, a Turkish author has published How Nations Succeed. And the theme we focused was on learning. Learning is so critical in industrial policy, trial and error. So we focused on four themes. First is learning. In terms of firms, is technological learning. In terms of government, it's policy learning. And if you also want to focus on industries, you need to look at clusters, at hubs, at meso level. The second element we saw was we didn't see the dichotomy of market forces and state activism. Actually, these two directions are always shifting from time to time, from sector to sector. And we understood that the complementary and dynamic relationship between these two. The third element we saw was assimilation of foreign knowledge and domestic capability go together. Learning is about acquiring new knowledge. And it doesn't mean you have to copy. It doesn't mean you have to abandon what you have. So the story we learned on How Nations Learn was these two go together. It's about assimilation of foreign knowledge. And this goes in different shapes. And then finally, diversified paths at the understanding the national peculiarities, sectoral peculiarities is quite important. And lastly, I just want to drop one element. We are all academics here. Of course, I wear two hats. I'm a practitioner and I also participate in scholarly contribution. So I would say I have better understanding how the theories relate to practice or what the limitations of practices are. And I see three structural gaps in terms of learning. The first one is there is a major gap between theory, policy, formulation, and practice. Absolutely, what we study in academics, in research, does not much influence what is happening in policy-making world or in shaping practice. Or the learnings are not based on extraction from the real practices. This is a major limitation. If we have to influence policy-making, we need to fill this gap. And I feel the current initiative will be able to contribute to this. The second one is externally driven frameworks do not contribute to learning, because the key to learning is policy independence. Earlier, I heard Celestine talking about that the industrial policy hub should not be the IFIs. This fashionable time, the time of the flavor will pass. But the key point is, from the past many decades history, what we know is externally driven framework doesn't work. And the third element is sectoral heterogeneity is underweighted. It's not given adequate focus. And sectoral focus is important if we are talking about industrial policy, if we are talking about industrial structures, to study about technological adaptation, about greening and everything. I must stop here, Danny.
Thank you, Archibald. So it's so important to hear about those success cases, and I want to come back to that maybe in the second round, ask you to talk a little bit more about maybe one or two of those cases and tell us a little bit about what the role of government and industrial policy specifically was, also maybe highlighting some pitfalls where to illustrate some of the general principles that you mentioned. But now let me turn to Santiago Levy, who's in Mexico City, I believe. Santiago, great to have you. I'm going to embarrass you by saying that I think of you as the father of Mexico's greatest export in recent times, which is the conditional cash transfer programs that spread after you started them with the Progresa program in Mexico that's now so well known. So you're no stranger to policy innovation. In the specific case of Mexico, of course, there's a very peculiar paradox that Mexico has benefited greatly from North American integration. It has contributed to its industrialization. If we're looking for a country, middle-income country that's actually doing pretty well in terms of industrialization, I think it's the only middle-income country that I know, certainly outside of East Asia, where the employment share in manufacturing is actually rising a little bit from the most recent data that I've seen. Yet Mexico as a whole, as you've highlighted in your work, has done very poorly in terms of overall productivity growth, even by Latin American standards. So how do we understand this paradox? I know your work has tried to scratch and find the reasons, but I'll let you speak.
Well, let me first begin by thanking you, Danny, not only for inviting me to the panel, it's a pleasure to be in it, but also for your kind words just now. And apologies to all. I very much wanted to be in Harvard this afternoon, but for family reasons, I must be in Mexico City. So with that, my take on this panel will be very much from a Latin American perspective. I heard Yuen and her experience and Archebe. I'm coming from a different angle. I'm coming from countries like Colombia, countries like Peru, countries like Ecuador, and of course countries like Mexico, which I know better than perhaps any other country. And so that's my perspective. Perhaps what I have to say is also relevant for MENA countries that I've studied them, a few of them, and have similar structures as Latin American countries. I don't think what I have to say is relevant for other regions of the world. So with that caveat, this region of the world, Latin America, is a region in which the issue of formal, informal employment is central, and the issue of informality is central. For the region as a whole, informal employment is more than 50% of employment. For the region as a whole, over the last 2.5 decades, productivity growth has been terrible, practically zero over 2.5 decades. And there's been persistent division between the formal and informal sector. All these things are connected. All these things are connected one with each other. So, as Danny was saying now, Mexico is exhibit one of this. And there are a lot of lessons for that. Mexico is a spectacular success in terms of manufacturing exports. Manufacturing exports went from 5% of GDP about 25 years ago to about 35% of GDP today. We now export about $500 billion worth of manufacturing exports, more than the sum of Latin America put together, more than the sum of Argentina plus Brazil plus Ecuador plus Peru. We take about 17% market share in the United States. So Mexico is an absolute spectacular export success, particularly manufacturing exports. Mexico is also a country in which over the last 20 years, total factor productivity has actually fallen. Formal employment has remained at less than half of employment, and informal employment maintained at 55% of employment. And 1 out of every 2 workers is either working self-employed or working for a firm that has up to 5 workers. And that hasn't changed in the last 25 years. So Mexico is exhibit 1 of a situation in which manufacturing exports and manufacturing is not enough to carry out the sort of productive transformation that we all have in mind. So my lesson from this, and Danny sort of when he sent me an email kindly inviting me to this panel, he said, from your policy side, what do you think of this? What are transformative policies that could generate inclusive growth today? And I'm going to give you a very boring answer. It's not going to be a fad, fashion, the latest, whatever is happening at the Kennedy School. I'm going to give you a very boring answer. After thinking of this for a long time, my boring answer is we have to tackle the underlying incentive structure that generates the formal-informal divide. This is endogenous to a set of policies. We can discuss the details of these policies. In my own work, I pay a lot of attention to labor and social insurance regulations. I pay a lot of attention to taxation, particularly all these special regimes for taxes, and I pay a lot of attention to corporate enforcement. And you can discuss the details, but this is a micro disaster. And for the last 25 years, Mexico, and by and large the countries of Latin America that I was speaking before, have tried to bypass this micro disaster. And my lesson from this is we were wrong. This was a big policy mistake. Let me use an analogy. Suppose that you see a building that is slanted and it's kind of sinking a little bit slowly. And you come and the policymakers say, look, I think in the 4th floor, what we need to do is paint the walls. And in the 5th floor, I think what we need to do is perhaps put these kinds of windows. And you say, wait a second, let's have some sanity check. The first thing you need to do is fix the underlying structure. You've got to fix the foundations. Otherwise, it's not going to work. The point I'm making is the basic building blocks for efficient resource allocation, even if you ignore market failures, even if you assume perfect certainty, macro beauty, no fiscal imbalances, everything perfect, the basic building blocks for efficient resource allocation are not there. And you cannot expect socially inclusive growth in that case. Mind you, I am not against productive development policies. I'm not against industrial policy. I've read a lot and learned a lot from Danny's work, from Ricardo's work. I was listening very attentively to what Yuen was saying. So I'm all for it. I'm making a point about sequence. I'm making a point that the first thing we should do is to stop anti-industrial policies that will carry on today. What we have in Latin America and what we have in Mexico is a lot of policies that can only be described as anti-productive transformation or anti-industrial policy, because basically what they do is they subsidize the low productivity sector of the economy and they tax the high productive sector of the economy, and they do it again and again. The modern sector was not able to pull this. The traditional development story of development being the transformation of shifting resources from low productivity activities to high productivity activities did not occur. And we should take a sobering lesson from this and pay attention that this was not being able to fix after this major success. So I'm going to conclude because I think I'm on minute 6 or so. What would be transformative? I think actually transformative would be for development economists to come to grips directly with the formal-informal divide. Do not expect that this is going to fade away because of growth. This is going to fade away because of investments in human capital. It's not going to happen. And I think it's time to bite the bullet, to really pay attention to that, and to understand that if we want transformation of society, you've got to transform societies in a deep sense. And socially inclusive growth cannot occur when societies are so segmented by these very distorting policies that I was speaking before. And after that, of course, there's a lot of room for productive development policies because there are market failures, and because there are all these information failures, and because there are all these, challenges with AI. But I am making a very boring case of first things first. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Senator. So that was great. I think everybody would agree that the first step in a productive development policy would be to remove anti-productive development policies, and I think that's a very useful reminder. I want to get back to you later in the second round and probe a little bit deeper on the formal-informal divide, because obviously that's a huge cleavage, not just in Latin America, but in a bigger way also in Sub-Saharan Africa as well, and ask you to what extent is that not just a reflection of the low productivity versus high productivity divide, productive dualism, unless you thought that high degrees of informality were driven purely from sort of regulations that prevented formalization. And so I'd like to hear your views on that. And also why, if manufacturing was so successful, especially in the North, why did it not expand despite the existing policy framework to expand employment? And what was the barriers to actually increasing employment? But our final, but certainly not least, we have Eliana Carranza from the World Bank. Asim already mentioned that Eliana is one of our students, a graduate of our MPAD and our PhD program. Equally important for me, Eliana visited as a faculty member in the Kennedy School for a few years, and we co-taught a course, actually the core course in the MPID program on development. So it's wonderful to have you back here. So you deal at the World Bank with a lot of these issues across all these different geographies. You'll be heading the next year's World Development Report, which I think is on jobs.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about your current thinking?
Okay, so it's very interesting that I am coming last because Asim opened this panel by mentioning, the macroeconomist camp and the microeconomist camp. I see myself as an integrator, really, between micro and macro, as well as between policy and research. And I am very pleased to be here as well because now that I am back, I noticed how much the conversation has evolved. When I was last here in Cambridge, I believe that the focus of the conversation was more like about finding that successful local innovation that we could take to scale, right? And to expand the coverage of this. But I do think that in that focus, we were missing the deeper issue. And the deeper issue is how do we institutionalize problem solving? And I think that echoes what we have heard today, across all of these presentations, right? Like the reality when we are dealing, with policy making is that every intervention has technical and implementation limits. And this is because what works in one place is often successful because it addresses a very specific set of constraints, a particular worker profile, a particular, sector characteristics, governance environment, and importantly, very different structures of local opportunities. So as programs start expanding, that is our aspiration, what we will inevitably find is greater heterogeneity. Different populations, different geographies, different constraints for which these solutions were designed. And that complexity is what drives a decline in the effectiveness of our tools. So when we are talking about taking local experimentation to the national level or aggregating, we are not only talking about expanding coverage, we are really talking about a need to manage complexity. And this is what we heard today, right? The real task is really how do we build structured portfolios of solutions that we can flexibly use to respond to different realities, while at the same time trying to preserve certain coherence across, all of these interventions. But often what we see in our countries is like that they fall in two extremes, right? Like they either, on one side, they have very rigid national blueprints that completely ignore local variation. And on the other side, we have very fragmented local experimentation, right? We have heard about how wonderful it is because, this type of experimentation that is driven mostly by private sector, non-government actors, sits closer, to the local realities. So they are better positioned to respond well to these realities. But at the same time, they remain disconnected. Oftentimes, these solutions are categorical, like organized around groups such as solutions for youth, solutions for women, solutions for such sector, rather than being organized around the underlying constraints that they are trying to resolve, right? Like, and because of this, it's very difficult to bring them back and to integrate them into a broader system. So what transformation really requires as a practitioner, and this is my view, is not really standardizing interventions, which is what we have been trying to do in the past, but standardizing how countries diagnose and solve problems. Countries need an institutional architecture that can systematically and continuously, and we heard about this, identify what constraints matter, where and for who, and to then deploy technically grounded responses accordingly to these needs. And this, we heard as well today, requires both vertical and horizontal coordination between national and local actors, and importantly, across sector ministries and private sector and non-government organizations. What I have observed is in the lack of this type of institutional architecture, what our successful programs are trying to do is to compensate precisely for the lack of these systems by embedding functions within the program design. Like, for example, we see education projects that are adding placement services. We see infrastructure projects adding training components. The problem with this thing is that while it's key, to increase the effectiveness of these interventions, by embedding these functions within the programs instead of externalizing them, we are preventing the development precisely of the systems that we need in order to be able to move the policy to a national level. So these type of approaches then are reinforcing fragmentation. We have duplication of functions, duplication of costs, and we are undermining, in the end, scale. So in my view, the frontier is not so much to move into creating more solutions. It's really about building now stronger systems. And for multinationals like the one in which I work, I think that this has important implications because our role has to move beyond financing programs. We need to really work with countries to build the governance systems, the financing systems, the delivery platforms, and the information systems that will allow innovation to aggregate into a coherent national strategy. And I have to say that even when this seems evident, it's not always easy because governments very rarely ask for systems. They ask for programs, they ask for training, they ask for economic zones, they ask for entrepreneurship initiatives. So the challenge that we face is how do we meet that immediate government demand while embedding the interventions that we are delivering within a broader institutional architecture that is strengthening and building national capacity over time. And I would say that these days, what I see the gap is countries are needing shared systems for diagnosing constraints. They need systems for profiling individuals, for referring these individuals or firms to different training components or interventions that can support their activities and address their problems that they are facing. We need a system that engages employers in a continuous way, that coordinates providers. And I was very interested in the example of signaling that you mentioned in China. And importantly also feeding lessons from implementation back into policy design. And this final point is critical, as we heard today, and we heard about the need to start thinking about doing policy under uncertainty in a changing environment. The challenge that we face is truly dynamic. And so we need to start embedding these feedback loops and building institutions that are capable of continuously refining strategies over time.
Thank you. Thank you, Eliana. I think the distinction that you drew between how successful systems as they develop are working, but in a very kind of local way of embedding the complementary inputs into the programs themselves as the needs arise, is very different from building the sort of national systemic capability of being able to do that. I wonder if that's not part of the, the second best response of, sort of in the context of settings where you don't have necessarily all that capability. But you've brought us all the way back to the question that I want to follow up with UN, which is the question of sort of the capacity of the state. And I want to just preface it by saying that, actually state capacity is what, I just had in my last class, I think I told my students that the term state capacity is a term that I hate because, it just obscures more than it illuminates. State capacity is just like everything else in development. You build it as you do it, and just saying that I can't do this or that because of state capacity limits here and there just is a non-starter. It's not a helpful way of starting to think. But nonetheless, it's not like I don't have this question mark in my head, and since I have you, so you have to give us your answer. So what is your answer to when people say, this is all fine and great for China, and they did it? We even buy your argument that this wasn't some top-down central planning kind of an approach, that it was experimental, it was improvised, even though sort of broad frameworks were being set up from top. It's not because China is a centralized authoritarian country that it was able to do this. Even we grant that. To what extent is this something that can be built in other settings? Can you tell us a little bit on that front?
Thank you very much for that important question. I'm really glad that you asked it because I get asked that question a lot. And I think in order to answer Danny's question, I need to be I need to push everyone to be a little bit honest. And I'm going to quote the editor of a major newspaper. We had a private conversation, and he was describing how news reporting about China was done, and he used 3 words.
In the U.S., American, or in China?
It's American. It's American, yeah. And the 3 big words he used to describe the reporting of China is big, scary, and weird. Okay, so yeah, so let that kind of sink in a little bit. I think that whenever we see China on the cover of a book or a study, we kind of have to ask ourselves, do we have some very innate association that pops up in our mind? And we immediately think, oh, this must be culturally bound, right? Authoritarian regime, big, weird, strange country, and so cannot travel anywhere else. I invite you to do a thought experiment. What if I told you the exact same story, except it's set in 17th century England? Will you still be asking me, can this travel? Well, we don't ask that of Douglas North. we just assume that whatever happened in the glorious revolution can travel to Kenya in 2025, right? So I think sometimes we need to kind of be a little bit honest and ask what are some of the deep-seated associations. But it's a serious question, right? Which part of China's experience travel and doesn't travel? That's a question we should not just ask about China. We should ask about theories coming out from America, from England, from Mexico, right? Let's make it an intellectual level playing field. So to address Danny's question, directed improvisation, often people ask me, oh my God, it happens in China. How can it apply anywhere else? So I just wanted to tell you that the term directed improvisation is not coined by me. I borrowed it. You can Google the term and you will find that it actually appears primarily before me in performing arts and computer programming. Okay? And you might ask, what is the commonality between performing arts, computer programming, and structural transformation? Well, the commonality is that these are three fields that require tremendous creativity. And that creativity cannot be just go do whatever you want. That actually is not creativity. I happen to know many artists, come from a family of it. So I know by experience that if you think artists are like freewheeling, eccentric people who do whatever they want, I know that that's not true. Artists are kind of like ascetic people like monks. They're very disciplined. Right? So that's why in performing arts, in order to direct improvisation, there's a whole art to how do you become a good director. When you do computer programming, you don't decide in advance what product will be produced, but the computer programmer has to set the parameters by which the process of creativity is carried out. And similarly, in China's context, when they opened markets in 1980s, the problem they faced was extremely immense. They didn't really know where they were going, didn't really know what the solutions were. The central government didn't know. They sort of course, have some general goals like they want China to be developed, they put food on the but they wouldn't know how to get there, right? So this required a process where the role of the central government was like a director, not a dictator. And their role was to set up the conditions for effective adaptation. It's not a metaphor. It's an art. It's a science. You can even make it into a computer program, which others have done before me. So what does it mean then for countries like Africa, where they do not have a single party that can mobilize the entire country? One of the things I would point out is nobody said that only the government can be a director, right? There are many other actors who can play the equivalent role of directing. And oftentimes what you might find in countries where you do not have that coherent, unified leadership is that you are more likely to see pockets of change, but not on a seismic scale that you see in China. But I don't think that it means that it doesn't matter, right? So we kind of have to be realistic about the scale of change with and without a unified, politically centralized leadership. But it doesn't then mean that directed improvisation is not important or that it cannot happen. Thank you.
No, that's very helpful. Arkebe, just following straight from that, how much of a connection do you see with the actual successes that you've seen and you were talking about in exemplifying in the previous round that sort of carries these commonalities, and what were some of the additional features that you've observed?
I mean, the experience and the peculiarities are quite different, as Ewan mentioned. But what I see from policy learning perspective, for instance, is given my Ethiopian experience, a key element in policy making is the ability to make mistakes and failures and make adjustment. One of the points highlighted in the note he sent us was about local experiments and then scaling up to national level. I want to give you an example of failure. We had a major housing program, a unique housing program, integrated condominium housing program in Addis Ababa. Very ambitious, very big, entirely financed by the city and commercial bank, and it was successful. We started with piloting. We started from learning from other experience. We couldn't find exactly what we need to emulate, but we came up with a very realistic option that can address the political concerns of the residents, as well as an efficient construction method that will lead to ownership by the middle class. And the program went quite well. Then we finally decided we have to scale it up. The biggest benefit was employment creation. The construction industry is so big. It also was an impetus to create steel industry, cement industry, a lot of linkages. So we decided to replicate to 35 cities in Ethiopia. And the regional presidents were quite excited, and a lot of politics was also added, and they asked more cities to be included. So finally, it reached 65 towns. And how to replicate, although the lessons of Addis Ababa were prepared, what to replicate to the different localities, we hadn't done the homework. And we saw in some cities it was progressing well, in many it wasn't succeeding. Even there were houses being built where there is no demand. And we had to make harsh decision. We freezed all new construction. We closed housing project in all 63 cities except city of Addis and Redawa. So this requires a very bold admission when you make mistake, because policy is about making things happen. You don't really know what you are going to face. So this is one aspect. The second aspect, which I believe is so important, and I would say also linked to Chinese experience. The Chinese have quite interesting concept of learning truth from facts, and also Deng Xiaoping's touching the stone to cross, which is about piloting. And on the industrial hubs development, until 2010, Ethiopia had not built a single industrial park, not a single. Senegal, Liberia, others had started building 1970s with Mauritius. Nigeria since 1980s. Ethiopia did not have for some reason. And our industrial policy had a big gap. It did not address the issue of industrial agglomeration, about clustering. But the first thing we did was we admitted we don't have a very clear policy and strategy. And when we saw also the African experience, we saw many of the parks are not contributing to industrialization. The purpose is to accelerate industrialization linkages, and we didn't see. So we decided to study anew the whole approach. So from first, we analyzed what was happening in Ethiopia, because some investors were coming and they were facing difficulties. Then from Africa, we selected two countries, Mauritius and Nigeria. Nigeria, mixed outcome. Mauritius, relatively successful, the APZ in the earlier days. Then from Asia, we selected carefully 4 countries. We selected Singapore, which was a pioneer in industrial parks, and China learned also from Singapore. And secondly, we took China, because China is a real, where real miracle had happened in industrial hubs, highly specialized parks, and a lot of linkages. We also then selected Vietnam, because we knew remotely Vietnam was following a different model, and Vietnam is closer to us. And then we look also at South Korea's experience. And a key point here was that what I want to highlight is the lessons had to be taken. It has to be targeted. We had real questions, and the questions, for instance, in China was not to look at the parks, existing ones. We were mainly interested in 1978, 1980. We wanted to know how the early parks, some were succeeding, some were not succeeding, like Shenzhen and the other three. We wanted to learn, and we never got satisfactory answer. So we had to find, and we found one of the vice mayor of Chongqing, who was working at that project at that time. So very targeted learning. And once we have integrated this, we developed white policy paper. We had to debate in the presence of all policymakers. And then the proclamation, the legislature, the institutional changes, all were properly designed. And we then said, we now have all the policies, we have all the legislation, we have made institutional reforms and the policy changes. But we said, how do we know whether it will be working? So we piloted at Hawassa Industrial Park, this new model, low carbon industrial park, specialized industrial park, and also a one-stop service, government services. And we built it, we learned a lot. It's a big project, and we learned a lot. And then parallel, we continued to build second phase, third phase. So the key point was how to integrate the lessons and also being able to expand. The pace, the sequence, all these are quite critical. So this is an element we need to look. And I also want lastly to highlight Hirschman's concept of this, what we call the law of hiding hand. Managing, being able, mega project is important. Scale, when we talk about industrial policy, at least in African context, we forget about scale. But scale is a critical element. Scale and speed are quite interesting. If you are going to build an industrial park, the industrial park we targeted was to build every park in 9 months. We couldn't achieve the others in 9 months, but in 15 months, we're able to do that. And I can tell you, in one of the East African countries, a park that was started 1994, when I visited 2017, it was started with financing of World Bank. It was only 10% completed. So which means the world has to wait 1,000 years until that country industrializes. So on the scale element is, if we look at power sector, every project of hydropower, because 90% of energy in Ethiopia is hydropower. Ethiopia is 100% using renewable, and it has been building parks based on mobilization of domestic resources primarily. So every project, if at the early stage we're building only 100 megawatt power projects, then we increased 400, 500, and then finally 5,000 of Grand Renaissance Dam. Huge challenge. But you learn a lot, you develop capability, you develop how to ensure bigger projects at scale. And that scale is critical because ultimately the issue of decreasing costs comes with scale. So in Ethiopia, the rate of electricity is 3 US cents, the cheapest in the world because of that scale. So
thank you, Arkebe. I'll have to interrupt because I'm very conscious of the time, and I do want to also go to Santiago and then Eliana. And
thank you.
I know that some of you want to have questions. I'm going to allow us 5 extra minutes because we did start a little bit late this session, so I won't let the previous session steal from us. But with that in mind, still maybe just 2 minutes, Santiago, and 2 minutes, and then we'll collect one round of very quick questions. Santiago, I'd asked you originally 2 questions. but you can either answer any one of them or reflect on what you've heard. But it's over to you.
So I think, let me merge your two questions into one. Why is this phenomenon persistent? Why did it not fade away as manufacturing export grew and they got a little bit market share? The process we all have in mind is, in a particular market, making shirts or making whatever. There's a low productivity firm, there's a high productivity firm. Eventually, the low productivity firm will go out of the market and the high productivity firm will grow. And this process of dynamic process, Schumpeter, whatever, brings about the transformation we're all seeking. That process does not occur in Mexico. And the reason is that the incentives are not there. The low productivity firm survives because it has huge tax, labor, and other advantages over the high productivity firm. And the high productivity firm doesn't grow because it is very, very highly taxed, and it'll be even more taxed if it grows more. So the micro incentives is what's getting on the way of the usual process that we all have in our mind, in which little by little, manufacturing exports and industrialization and all this is going to transform. This is the key point. Let me just rephrase in a slightly different word. We have placed too much faith on the ability of product market reforms, trade, competition policy, productive development policy, industrial subsidy, too much faith to change very deeply distorted microeconomic incentives that persist through time. That's kind of the big lesson, I think, from Mexico and from Latin America. And that's why my big point is we've got to tackle this. And then we can do other things, of course, but we've got to tackle this because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. So all good macroeconomists and in the foundations, which is microeconomics, right? So thanks for reminding us. Eliana, I just wanted to get back to you on a subject of conversation that we had actually in the previous panel when we're discussing about the role of workforce development, training, scaling, providing vocational training, the skills. And then there was a question about whether should we do that first, or what's the role of working on the labor demand side, working with developing firms and increasing labor demand by supporting and sustaining firms' capabilities to expand and hire more and so forth. In your work, sort of where do you end up putting the balance on that?
So it's very interesting because I believe that at the bank right now there are, two camps, right? Like actually two different conversations. One is precisely on whether Africa, should be putting more emphasis on developing manufacturing versus services. That's one of the controversies. The other one is between the modern sector and whether we need to build that or whether we need, to serve populations that are currently, excluded. And then the other one is on skills versus demand side approaches. And again, I believe that it's not about either or. It depends on the context, right? Like what is what you need. So for me, it's not about whether we should choose between manufacturing or service or whether, think about modern sector type of jobs versus livelihood type of programs. It depends where and for who, right? So if we have a place where we have low skills and very limited opportunities for employment, and I like what some previous panelists mentioned about the need to use different policy levers, right? In this type of environments, we do need to protect the livelihoods first. So the type of policies that we will have in place there are most likely going to be things that are related to productive economic inclusion, safety nets, things that stabilize incomes. And by stabilizing incomes, you're allowing people, to make better decisions in terms of, investments in skills, investments in activities in specific sectors, right? If we are in an environment in which you have high skilled workers, but they are being underutilized, then the emphasis has to be put in policies that are expanding the demand, right? And there will be places in which you have both, and this was my experience when I was working in Mexico at some point of time, that it was, the opportunities were there, the workers with the skills were there. What was lacking is the connection between them, right? Like, and then we needed like policies addressing either spatial frictions or matching frictions. Yeah.
Great. Okay. The only answer in economics that's always true. It depends. Okay. So with that, there'll be opportunities in the sort of, over refreshments to talk more about these, but I want to give anybody who has a burning question to ask the panelists. I see one hand going up, another one there. Okay, very quickly, and a third one will stop there very quickly. And if you're directing your question to somebody on the panel, be explicit about that and be very short, please.
My name is Luis. I'm a current master's student. Currently, there are less than 1,000 American students in China and over 270,000 Chinese students in America. Do you feel there's a huge, what's the current status of mutual understanding and do you feel like of all the experts that study China, what's the level of expertise, and do you feel like it's worsening or getting better? Probably not getting better, but
Thank you.
All right.
Got it. There was a question over there. Yes. Can you stand up? There's a microphone making its way.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a three-time professor of economics at GEM26 Monaco. I have sometimes the impression that we are sort of looking for recipes. Also, so we find different ways to find some recipes. Some of us tell us we find recipes by experimenting. We trial, we experiment on, and then we go elsewhere. But recipes are conditional on ingredients that you have, they are local and so on. And I have the impression that sometimes in the ingredients, institutions are missing. And what are the key institutions? Are the institutions that enables the design of recipes, the design of knowledge. And knowledge about development and so on is, I will say, I think Daniel Rodriguez wrote a paper on that recently on world development, I think article. I mean, the global world, Africa has remained totally peripheral in terms of finding the recipes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And final comment or question, if you can keep it short, thank you.
Alan Clutterberg from Argentina. My question is to Santiago. In the process of reconverting an economy, it's not only, I think, in the case of Argentina, an issue of informal versus formal, but it's also in a case of an economy that was closed when you open up, and how you mitigate and how you manage the political economy of opening up with all the high costs of instability, not only of the informal sector, but of the formal sector as well.
Thank you. So one question to Yuen, I think, and one question to Santiago, and then we'll wrap up. Yuen, or Santiago, you go ahead. Did you hear the question? Could you
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the question. Argentina is more difficult because Argentina's story is also one of macroeconomic instability. So that brings in another layer of complication. My story was cleaner because it was story taking place in a very stable macro environment in which all those issues could be put to the side. You're correct that when you have another layer of complications in which there's short-run variations in demand and employment associated with the macro shocks, this makes policy making all the more complicated. I think you've got to stabilize, you've got to open up. But if Argentina can learn a page from Mexico, is don't then say, let's just invest in human capital, sit back, relax, and enjoy. No, you've got to tackle the domestic underlying problems, particularly having to do with the labor market and taxation.
Thank you, Santiago. Yuan, you have the last word. Please say something to make us feel hopeful about the state of US-China relations.
Yeah, I promise to make it really short, and I won't hold you back from the reception. I think I'll invert your question about mutual understanding. Mutual understanding is actually premised on self-understanding. Yeah, but we don't think very much about self-understanding. So for instance, we tend to assume that, oh, surely China must know its own development model. And I can tell you that's not true. Even at the level of Beijing, they often are still struggling to explain, how did we come so far? What really worked for us? And I would say that's even more true of America today, right? This struggle of
the question is what happened to us?
What happened? Where are we going? How did we get here? So I think both societies are in a stage of trying to re-understand themselves again, and it is on that basis that we can then move to the next level of talking about mutual understanding. So thank you very much for the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you all the panelists. I think this has been a great discussion. Please join me in thanking them.